Chapter 801. The impassioned and powerful declaration suddenly turned into dirty words with a double meaning. He shouted at the old master that he wanted to kill the Abbey Dean, and smashed her with his staff. Ordinary people and extraordinary people were all human beings. They would turn into dust after death. But there was a big difference between them when they were alive. The old man's crutch could not beat the Abbey Dean. The people on the snow street all thought that old Master Chow was dead. But in fact he was not. The Abbey Dean did nothing, and just walked past him calmly. The eldest brother vaguely guessed the Abbey Dean's intention. Taoism wanted to destroy Chang'an City, and also the hearts of the people in Chang'an. The Abbey Dean's massacre on the Long Street was to use the most powerful means to smash the hardest shell of the Tangs, and trample their pride into the mud. Since killing could not solve the problem, then he chose to ignore it. But the Abbey Dean did not know the Tangs very well. Old Chow had walked on the edge of life and death, but he did not become confused, suspicious, or even afraid because of the Abbey Dean's ignorance. If he did not hit him, he would have another chance in the future. If he did not die, he did not die. Being alive was better than being dead. There was no need for self-doubt. Old Chow leaned on his crutch and walked to the side of the street, cursing. His words were dirty, even dirtier than the dirty things in the snow. The Abbey Dean raised his eyebrows slightly, and continued to walk toward Ning, Quebec. They would soon reach the Imperial Palace. Eldest brother said, "This is not right." The Abbey Dean said, "Although the Tang Empire is strong, it is doomed. What can you do?" In front of the verdant canyon, Yi Hongyu looked at Jun Mo. Blood flowed down her sleeves and onto the ground, mixing with the blood stains that had accumulated over the past few days. She was very calm because she knew that Jun Mo was much more seriously injured than she was. He was burning the last of his psyche power, and even his life, even though he was facing death. Looking at Jun Mo's expressionless face, and the blood-soaked disciples of the academy behind him, she recalled the thrilling battles in front of the verdant canyon in the past 7 days. She thought about how these few people had blocked the mighty Divine Hall Coalition army in the south of the Tang Empire, and prevented them from advancing north. Someone like Jun Mo, fighting bitterly and on the verge of death. Even she couldn't help but be somewhat moved. The deepest part of her eyes was filled with the brilliance of the divine stars, as well as a bit of pity and admiration. What can you do if the heavens want to destroy your academy? She looked at Jun Mo. Jun Mo looked up at the sky. At this time, the rain had stopped, but the clouds had not completely dispersed. Only a few spots of the clear sky could be seen, like broken porcelain. Furthermore, even if the rain and clouds dispersed and the sky was completely clear, there was no way for him to see that bright moon. Before he died in battle, he only took a glance at his teacher. He did not directly answer Yi Hongyu's question. Instead he said, "Chow Xiaoshu is a very good person. If nothing had happened back then, he would have been my younger brother." Yi Hongyu knew who Chow Xiaoshu was, but she did not understand why Jun Mo would mention him at this time. Jun Mo looked at the sky, searching for the traces left by the bright moon on the previous 7 nights. He continued, "It's just that he liked to follow the former emperor, so he didn't enter the academy. Back then, the former emperor was determined to clean up the imperial court, so there was that night at Spring Breeze Pavilion." Yi Hongyu knew the famous night at Spring Breeze Pavilion. The names of Chow Xiaoshu and Ning Ke were only noticed by the West Hill Divine Palace after that rainy night. Jun Mo withdrew his gaze and looked at her. He said, "Before that night, Chow Xiaoshu negotiated with the other party at the House of Red Sleeves. He said 2 sentences, which were widely spread in Chang'an after that. At that time, he said these 2 sentences. Jun Mo said, 'If the heavens can tolerate me, I can live. If not, I will kill.'" Yi Hongyu suddenly felt a little cold, because she knew what she was going to hear next. Although the whole world was against the Tang Empire, and Haotian Taoism, and the Tang Empire were irreconcilable, she still did not expect that in the world of Haotian, someone would raise this question so calmly and firmly. As expected, Jun Mo lightly shook his right arm, and the wide and square iron sword splashed down a stream of blood. He held the iron sword and looked at Yi Hongyu, as if he was looking at the sky above her head. He said, "I have always thought these 2 sentences were not appropriate. because even if the heavens cannot tolerate me, I still want to live. If the evil heavens really cannot tolerate me, then I cannot allow it to live either. He finally said. At least I cannot let it live too happily. On the snowy street in Chang'an, eldest brother looked at the Abbey Dean and said, the headmaster once said that the heavens will obey the will of the people. If the heavens do not obey, if the heavens cannot tolerate, then what will you do? The Abbey Dean stopped and looked at the falling snow. After a pause, he said thoughtfully, you can look up and see if the heavens have ever spared anyone. It was quiet. No one spoke, because no one could answer the Abbey Dean's question. In the face of absolute power, courage was admirable, but there was no power. In the cold eyes of the heavens, humans' will was never important. The skinny Taoist was silent. The old lady of Chu was silent. The injured were silent. The dead could not speak. Even Chao Erbai's lips moved for a while, but no words came out. Finally, a voice broke the silence of the world. The voice was very hoarse and dry. It was probably because he had not drunk water for a long time, and he had lost too much blood in his body. It sounded a little harsh to the ears. The voice sounded very tired, and even a little weak. But it was very determined. The so-called harsh sound was not like the sound of a sharp object rubbing against a mirror, but the sound of a mirror breaking. The voice said, then destroy it. The Abbey Dean looked at the back of the crowd, and saw Ning Kei's bloody face. Then he saw Ning Kei's eyes. Their eyes met for the first time in a long time. Ning Kei looked at him and said, the heavens will obey the will of the people. If the heavens do not obey, then destroy it. I think this is a very simple truth. The Abbey Dean looked at the determination and confidence in his eyes, and slowly raised his eyebrows. The natural stream magical finger had seriously injured Ning Kei, and destroyed his confidence. But at that time, his spiritual world was still firm. Later, he gradually became a little absent-minded. He looked at the two youths crying, and doing the most unimaginable thing in the world. So he decided to stand up. He really stood up. But he could only rely on the padao to support his weak body. Then countless ordinary people ran past him, and ran towards the Black Sea of Death. He saw many people die in front of him. He felt that it was wrong. The choices of these ordinary people completely went against his understanding of this world, and his rules. Although he had seen many similar scenes on the battlefield, the scene he saw today still brought him an unbearable mental shock. Because in the past, he had always put himself out of the picture. Today he was on this street in the picture. His body and soul, along with the blood, as the bodies fell, and the souls scattered, finally landed on this world. In the past, he was willing to die for Chang, and because of his responsibility and affection. He insisted that it was not because he was hot-blooded, because of his responsibility and affection for the academy, the headmaster, his master Yin Sei, and his majesty. He thought that his blood was cold. When the blood in his body began to heat up and even boil, he began to be confused, and his mental state became a little absent-minded. He vaguely felt a kind of power. He had seen that kind of power more than once, but there had never been a time when he felt it more vividly than at this moment on the snowy street. At this moment, an old voice began to ring in his ears and heart. He did not know that it was Uncle Chao who was talking. The old voice echoed throughout the Tang Empire. His consciousness seemed to float to the great rivers and mountains. He saw all kinds of people everywhere. Those people were fighting, marching, risking their lives, persevering, or just waiting. But that kind of waiting was also full of a kind of impressive tenacity. He saw many people, and they were all extraordinary people. Following that, many more scenes flashed past his eyes. He saw the blood-stained hatchet in the woodshed, the cracked fields of Hebei County, the starving people like ghosts, the vast Min Mountain, the old hunters, the soil of the city of Wei, the lanterns of Chang'an at night, the lake in the wilderness, and the moss-covered tomb in the Lang Temple. He saw many people. Perhaps they were not extraordinary, but they were all people. He seemed to have returned to the stone statue of the Lang Temple and meditated. He seemed to have had his last conversation with Lotus in the White Bone Mountain, at the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine. He seemed to have seen the Talisman Master in the primitive tribe when he entered Talisman Taoism that summer. The earliest humans fought with wild beasts in the wilderness. They began to wear animal skins, eat meat, and live in caves. Then they began to farm, raise livestock, and eat more meat. They continued to eat meat, and thought of many ways to cook meat to ensure that the meat was delicious. They could eat more meat, because eating meat could make them stronger. He saw humans building houses, villages, and roads. Finally, he saw a magnificent city standing on the plains, as if it was going to pierce through the sky. That was Chang'an. He walked in Chang, and saw the bun shop he had seen a few days ago. He remembered the aura that day, the power that only belonged to the human world. This power could change the world. This power could defeat time. This power was the most ordinary, and the most extraordinary. It was the most dazzling, and the most inconspicuous. It was the hot fog in the bun shop, or a brick in the city wall. But it was also the inheritance of wisdom and unyielding resistance. Ning-Ke suddenly felt very touched. This power was so great. But he was so close to it, and he could feel it so clearly. He felt his own insignificance. But it was not like when he faced Haotian. He would not be angry because of his own insignificance, but only respect and yearn because of his own insignificance. Because no matter how insignificant he was still a part of this power. No matter how great this power was, it came from countless insignificant people like him. I will write 2 more chapters tomorrow. I will try my best. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 802. This was the power of the human world. It was not the first time that Ning-Ke had sensed its existence. In the wilderness, the headmaster had summoned the ancient sword from the sword garret thousands of miles away to kill the golden dragon. He had used this power. In the houses across the Yanming Lake, he had also sensed this power. What he did not understand was how to use this power for himself. He had asked the headmaster of the academy about this. The headmaster of the academy said that he was the human world, and his power was the power of the human world. The answer was simple and meaningless to him. He looked at the bright moon in the night sky and thought of the headmaster. He looked at the pine tree by the cliff and thought of the youngest uncle. He looked at the bloody front yard of the Lank temple and thought of Lotus. He thought of the last conversation with the headmaster by the Sisui River. It turned out that Lotus was right. The youngest uncle was proud and free. He wanted to represent the human world and pierce through the sky as a powerhouse. The headmaster of the academy thought that he was the human world, and he wanted to lead the human world to challenge Haotian. However, the human world was where people lived. The power of the human world came from everyone who lived there. This power could not be represented and did not need to be led. It could only be exerted when everyone was together. The headmaster of the academy built the Tang Empire and was actually on the right path. However, the headmaster of the academy still wanted to lead everyone to do this through education and guidance. Because of his obsession, the state that Lotus had reached was still some distance away from the headmaster of the academy and the youngest uncle. However, it was also because of his obsession that he thought more extreme. In the night rain, he looked at his wife's grave and wanted to dig it up. However, he gave up and floated away. From that moment on, Lotus had gone crazy. After that, whether it was the destruction of the devil's doctrine or the massacre of Lank, it was all because he had gone crazy. He wanted to destroy the world. In his eyes, life and death had no meaning, including himself. He had been pursuing the devil to cover the sky and obey the heaven with Taoism. Finally, he reached the Nirvana realm with Buddhism and jumped out of the 3 realms. He wanted to erase the ruthless heaven's way of the old world in a brand new world and find something that he wanted to find through time. In other words, he wanted to break the most fundamental rule of the world. He wanted to destroy Haotian, and the method he chose was to make the entire human world go crazy with him, or even destroy it. This method was bloody and cruel, but it was correct. If Haotian knew that there was such a person who came up with such a crazy idea, just because he wanted to resurrect his wife in the tomb, he would probably tremble. Ning-Ke had wandered around the world with Sang-Sang when he was a child, so he did not have much patience. Therefore, whenever Sang-Sang could do something, he would teach her one thing. Do your own things. Therefore, the affairs of the human world should be done by people, and everyone should do it together. Ninkei opened his eyes and found himself still standing on the snowy street. He did not know if he had already woken up, or if he was still in a dream. He looked at the injured people on the street, who were clenching their teeth and refusing to let out a scream. He looked at the corpses of the ordinary people. He looked at the two heavily injured but stubborn teenagers. He understood many things. Chang'an was not a city. It was people. It was everyone who lived in the city. The power of the human world came from everyone who lived here. Several people, dozens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, millions of people. Everyone's wishes and desires were a kind of power. The desire of millions of people was the power of the human world. This power was so powerful that it could change the appearance of heaven and earth, and it could resist the passage of time. This power was like a bloody wave when it came to Lotus. This power was like the mark left by the sword when it came to youngest uncle. This power was like the desire of the headmaster to break the sky. But that wasn't even the full extent of this power. Lotus could not get the recognition of this power, or he did not have the opportunity to mobilize this power. Youngest uncle was heroic and unparalleled, so he was lonely. The headmaster could be called the teacher of all ages, but he forgot that the ink scroll should always be written by the students themselves. Master Yensei spent his whole life looking for that word. That word represented the power of the human world. But as the Abbey Dean once said, that word was too heavy. How could the will of millions not be heavy? And how could the will of millions be the same? Therefore no one could write that word. Even the headmaster could not write it. At this time, Ninkei finally saw that word clearly. He saw many people on the Vermilion Bird Avenue. Thousands of ordinary people came together for the same purpose. They built a new city wall with their flesh and blood. The will of the people really became a city at this time. The will and desire of the tens of millions of people here were strong and united. This was a part of the human world. For Chang'an City, this was the most desperate and angry moment. But it was the best moment to write that word. The question Ninkei needed to think about now was how to write that word. Seeing that word did not mean that he could write it. Just like when he first came to the old library and looked at the shelves full of precious classics, he looked at those words that he had seen countless times, but he could not even remember them, not to mention write them. He thought of the 3 months on the sea and the conversation with the headmaster. The headmaster said that Haotian was not the world itself, but the collection of the most fundamental rules of the world. The headmaster said that when the rules controlled the world was stable and boring. Only when the new power appeared and broke the old rules, the world could be lively and interesting again. The headmaster said that human was the greatest product of the world, because human had wisdom and could inherit. Human had the instinct to fight against, and even break the fundamental rules of the world. That kind of will was so stubborn and powerful that it could be called desire. Therefore, the human world and Haotian would inevitably go against each other until there was a winner. In the past history of the world, Haotian won countless times, and the human world ushered in countless long nights. The inherited wisdom withered in the cold eternal night, but the human world would always revive and challenge again. It was daytime now, so the sky was naturally white. The snowflakes falling from the sky were also white. The Vermilion Bird Avenue in the wind and snow was pure white. The accumulated blood on the street gradually turned black. The Tangs lying in the pool of blood were all wearing dark clothes. The bricks, iron pots, and chamber pots scattered on the street were all dirty and black. Since Haotian chose white, the human world chose black. The world became black and white in Ninkei's eyes. Light and darkness, holiness and filth. The black and white world became an extremely simple picture in his eyes. It became two absolutely parallel lines, looking at each other coldly and unwilling to get close. The two lines were shortened, and then they had a length. Ninkei was very familiar with this picture. It was the first divine talisman he learned, the two horizontal talisman. Then one of the lines suddenly deflected and stabbed into the other line. This was the second divine talisman he learned last night by the lake, the E-talisman. When the two lines touched, the two worlds were connected, but they could not merge and began to have a fierce conflict. A piercingly cold cutting intent, as if it wanted to cut open the entire space. Different from Master Yensei's Jing Fu, which had its own rules and its own calm area. The Ifu spread around endlessly, just like weeds growing fiercely. The E-talisman was very powerful. Besides cutting, the two worlds could be connected. It had a kind of endless meaning, representing the balance between the human world and Haotian. But this was not what Ning Ke wanted, nor was it what Chang'an needed now. Looking at the E-talisman on the snowy street, he seemed to see countless weeds, or two dry sticks of firewood, or even a chopper stuck in the fertile plains. The two firewood could not be put together firmly, and one of the firewood slowly collapsed. A hand grasped the handle, trying to pull the chopper out of the field. Suddenly, a stone with moss appeared in the weeds. It was the stone at the bottom of the Daming Lake in front of the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine. When youngest uncle broke the stone array tactics, he cut 2 sword marks on each stone. 2 sword marks, 1 word. Ning Ke really woke up. He was familiar with this situation. He had similar experiences when he saw the sword marks left by youngest uncle at the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine, and when he faced the stone statue of the Venerable in the Lank Temple. Today he meditated on the snowy street for a short time, but he gained a lot. Even if some of them could not be used by him now, they would become the most precious treasures on his cultivation path, as long as he could survive. He knew something had happened. Then he heard Uncle Chow say, F***CKU. Then he heard the Abbey Dean ask eldest brother, "Has heaven ever spared anyone?" He had heard this sentence before. At the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine, Lotus had asked him the same question. At that time, his answer was, "Man can conquer heaven, and there is no need for heaven to spare him." But today he did not want to answer like this. There were hundreds of old, weak women and children between him and the Abbey Dean. For him, these old, weak women and children were thousands of people. Passing through the thousands of people, he looked into the Abbey Dean's eyes and said, "If heaven does not obey, then just destroy it." Compared with his answer to Lotus years ago, his answer today was calmer and more certain. It was not because he had the confidence to defeat the Abbey Dean, nor was it because he wanted to show his arrogance. It was because he had really thought through the truth, so he was calm. Because if heaven did not obey the will of man, then the only way was to destroy heaven. No matter whether he would win or lose, he had to do it. Because so this was the truth of the academy. After saying this, he held the hilt, and was ready to pull the padao out from the ground. With this movement, the slowly rotating liquid in his abdomen suddenly exploded and sprayed everywhere. The Great Spirit grew wildly like weeds, shaking its waist. Chang'an City sensed the change on the snowy street. Endless chi of heaven and earth fell with the wind and snow, and poured into his body through the array pestle. His aura suddenly changed, and began to climb toward the peak of the knowing destiny state. Note: the dog at home is sick and is urinating blood. It has been running outside for a whole day. I am not complaining but updating very late. I want to explain to you. I will continue to write the 2nd chapter. I hope I can finish it before 2 o'clock. In addition, I strongly feel that the chapters in the 2nd volume of Being Possessed by the Devil are worth revisiting. About Ning Ke teaching Sangsang, do your own thing. This is a sentence my niece's kindergarten teacher taught her when she was young. At that time, whenever I wanted to help her with something, she always told me seriously, "Do your own thing," and vice versa. I love her very much, and I miss her very much. My dear, I know you will see this. Please say hello to your classmates for me. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 803. The Chi of Heaven and Earth in Chang'an was so vast that it could not be calculated. At this moment, it was pouring into Ning Ke's body through the array pestle along his left hand. The chi of heaven and earth had no substance or quality. It was clearer than the clearest water and lighter than the lightest air. But there was too much of it entering his body, which naturally brought him an unbearable burden. If an ordinary person, even a cultivator at the peak of the knowing destiny state, had absorbed so much chi of heaven and earth in such a short period of time, he would have been crushed to death. But Ning Ke cultivated the Great Spirit, and his body was stronger than steel. Except for the Abbey Dean, who cultivated the Taoism, Buddhism and the Devil's Doctrine, and third sister Yu Lian, who was the leader of the Devil's Doctrine. No one was stronger than him. His body was like a container made of stainless steel, which was used to make the primordial 13 arrows. It withstood the chi of heaven and earth, and compressed it to an unimaginable degree. At this moment, he was like a seashell in the depths of the sea. His body and soul were under terrible pressure, but he did not know when they could condense into dazzling pearls. It was a very painful process, but he showed no expression on his face, except for his eyelashes that kept blinking and the snow on his clothes that kept melting. He just looked at the Abbey Dean. The wounds on his body opened up again, and blood gushed out. The blood was like red jade, and when it came into contact with the cold wind on the street, it dispersed into extremely fine particles. Those particles left the surface of his clothes and drifted in the air around him. They looked like flames or fog. He looked like a burning man, or an extremely cold man of ice. He continued to pull out his cutlass. The sharp blade slowly rose from the bluestone cracks on the Vermilion Bird Avenue, bringing out black mud, and was about to leave the snow. Many things happened in Chang'an. In the early morning, the Abbey Dean waved his sleeves to break the stone array tactics, entered the city, and defeated the eldest brother and third sister of the academy. Then many divine talismans appeared in front of him, telling him that it was a dead end. From that moment until he saw the Abbey Dean in the wind and snow on the Vermilion Bird Avenue, Ning Ke went to many places in Chang, and erased many traces left by Haotian in the God-stunning array. Though he didn't completely repair the God-stunning array, he left behind enough divine talismans. Those divine talismans were formed by 2 knife marks, which looked like the Chinese character E. These divine talismans put the Abbey Dean in a difficult position. They prevented him from entering the imperial palace and destroying the array eye of the God-stunning array. They forced him to walk into the wind and snow on the Vermilion Bird Avenue and kill Ning Ke first. Ning Ke was seriously injured by the 7 natural stream magical fingers. He did not continue to write the talisman of E, because it was meaningless. However, the hundreds of talismans he wrote did not disappear. Instead, they continued to float in the streets and alleys of Chang, and under the support of the God-stunning array, and gradually disappeared into the wind and snow. As he unsheathed his sword, hundreds of talismans reappeared. On the street, at the end of the alley, in the well in front of the yamen, behind the wall, in the garden, under the willows, beside the plum trees. Hundreds of talismans reappeared in Chang'an. Inconceivably, these divine talismans were still changing. To be precise, these talismans were changing shape. These talismans were formed by 2 knife marks which were 2 strokes. 1 stroke and 1 stroke. As Ning Ke unsheathed his sword, the stroke slowly rose to the right, as if it was going to float away from the stroke. This stroke was like an arrow. The invisible bowstring was pulled back farther and farther away from the bow, and at the same time, it was accumulating more and more power. It was also like a knife that was leaving the ground and was about to show its sharpness. Unsheathing a sword was a very simple action. Ning Ke had repeated it countless times in his life. He was very familiar with it, so he finished it in a very short time. The changes in the streets and alleys of Chang and also happened in a very short time. The situation suddenly changed. The first person to feel the changes in Ning Ke and Chang and was not the Abbey Dean, eldest brother, or the people on the snowy street. It was the sky above their heads. The water at the bottom of the well at the entrance of the alley had long been frozen. Suddenly, 2 knife marks appeared. 2 knife marks appeared on the snow-covered bell, and 2 knife marks appeared on the Yinming Lake. The water in the well began to ripple again, and so did the sound of the bell. The willow branches by the Yinming Lake began to sway in the cold wind. Thick snow fell from the pine trees in the Tantua Temple. A fat squirrel sat on the food for the winter under its buttocks and kept rubbing its forelimbs. It did not understand why it was frozen before. The aura that enveloped the lakes, mountains, pagodas, and temples instantly disappeared as hundreds of talismans reappeared and changed shape. Even the falling snow suddenly stopped, and the frozen Chang and came back to life. The unknown aura continued to spread around with Ning Ke's action. At the same time, it rushed to the sky, wildly dispersing the thick snow clouds. The blue sky reappeared. When the headmaster of the academy left the human world, the Abbey Dean was the first in the world. The sky was the first to feel this change, and he was the second to feel it. He sensed the danger. His eyes suddenly became lighter than gray, until they were transparent, like crystals. There were countless lights and shadows moving at a high speed in them, as if many stories were happening on the screen. He saw some scenes that he could not believe. In Chang'an, the Abbey Dean could not see the future clearly, just as he could not see what the academy would become in the future. However, he once saw some scenes that he firmly believed. But those scenes changed. At the moment when Ning Ke pulled out his knife, the snow stopped and the wind stopped. The Vermilion Bird Avenue was very quiet. The Abbey Dean looked at Ning Quebec. His eyes returned to normal, but there was a touch of surprise left behind. He believed in Taoism, and he had no love or hate for things like killing. Today the Abbey Dean had killed countless people. He had his reasons and his needs. He wanted to kill Ning Ke previously because of his needs. However, he wanted to kill Ning Ke now because of an inexplicable vigilance. This vigilance was so strong that it even caused his Tao heart to sway slightly. He wanted to kill Ning Quebec. This desire was almost an instinct. But he sensed that there was something hidden in the air between him and Ning Quebec. He could not enter the limitless state, so he could not kill Ning Ke in the shortest time. So he could not let Ning Ke raise that knife at least. The Abbey Dean looked at Ning Ke and said, "Those who believe in." Ning Ke did not know why he spoke at this time. The disciples of the academy in front of the verdant canyon would definitely think of the West Hill scriptures that the great divine priest of Revelation had read. It was the Taoist divine skill that was as famous as the Xiankong Temple's chief preaching monk's words. Ning Ke did not die, because the Abbey Dean only had time to say these 3 words. Because eldest brother said these 3 words at the same time. Z does not speak. After saying these 3 words, his face suddenly turned pale, and more blood flowed out of his cotton-padded jacket. Ning Ke finally pulled out his knife, after such a short delay. The blade completely left the snow. Looking at the knife in his hand, the Abbey Dean took a step back. Retreating meant leaving. For thousands of years, he was the only one who had killed his way into Chang'an. He was about to destroy the God-stunning array, the Tang Empire in the academy, and achieve a great achievement. As long as he could kill Ning Ke, he could achieve all of this. For the Abbey Dean, this was a very simple thing, and naturally a great temptation. But he wanted to leave, without any hesitation, without any reluctance. Only a person with a truly bright Taoist heart could do this. There was no wind or snow on the street. The Abbey Dean could not move forward, so he stepped back. His right foot stepped on the ground, and wind and snow appeared under his foot. An invisible door appeared in the wind and snow. The door could only be seen by people in the limitless state. The Abbey Dean's right foot stepped into the door, and his indigo robe suddenly became transparent. The next moment, he was about to step into the void, the chi of heaven and earth in Chang, and had been disturbed by Ning Ke, but it still could not stop him from leaving. Ning Ke was not going to let him leave, because he had already pulled out his knife. When the blade left the snow, it made a very faint sound, like a brush dipped in oil brushing across a piece of meat that had been roasted over a bonfire, or like a brush dipped in ink sliding across a snow-white paper. Hundreds of soft sounds were heard in the streets and alleys of Chang'an, and beside the willows and plum trees. It was like the sound of a zither, like the sound of a bowstring, and most like the sound of a blade being unsheathed. That was the sound of friction between the skimming and pressing. It was the sound of hundreds of talismans. Then, there were more sounds of blades being unsheathed. This time, it was a real sound. Dozens of pig slaughtering knives hanging on the wall of the Eastern City pork shop had been lonely in their leather sheaths for a day and a night. Suddenly, they broke out of their sheaths. Not far from Vermilion Bird Avenue, there was a sharp knife stabbed into a chopping board in a certain house. The knife was stained with fresh blood. Not far away, there was a pot of stewed meat steaming. Suddenly, the kitchen knife jumped out of the chopping board. 2 teenagers were lying in a pool of blood beside the Vermilion Bird Avenue. They were seriously injured and leaned against the wall that was wet with snow. Although they were not dead, They could no longer hold the knives and forks beside them. Suddenly, the two choppers and the kitchen knife jumped out of the snow and landed beside their hands. Ning-Ke pulled out his knife. All the knives in Chang'an were pulled out. Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of knives began to show their sharpness. The winter willows by the Yanming Lake were fluttering. The pine trees in the Tantua temple were bowing. The snow on the whetstone floated up. One of the lines among the hundreds of divine talismans moved very slightly. The snow on the long street was blurred and countless sharp auras suddenly appeared. The invisible door was cut into pieces in an instant. Countless tiny cracks appeared on the Abbey Dean's indigo robe. Many cracks also appeared on his powerful body that was forged from the heavenly demon realm. The Abbey Dean began to bleed, a lot of blood. Ning-Ke raised his knife and said, "I want to kill you." As he spoke, the absolutely condensed chi of heaven and earth spurted out from his lips and turned into a half-foot-long white mist. There were tiny flashes of thunder and lightning in the mist, as well as his strong desire. 2 more chapters tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 804. Ning-Ke didn't say, "I want to kill you." Instead, he said, "I want to kill you." He seemed very careful, but his calmness and prudence showed that he really wanted to do it. Because this was the desire of everyone in Chang'an City, he wanted to fulfill this desire. So he said that sentence very seriously, and at the same time, he issued his own call or request. As if hearing his call, a loud and clear chirp suddenly sounded in the south of the street. The wind and snow on the Vermilion Bird Avenue had stopped, but the snow was still there. The Vermilion Bird painting, which had frightened Ning-Ke and Sang-Sang in the spring rain, was now buried in the deep snow, as if it had been frozen and lifeless. The Vermilion Bird painting was the killing talisman of the god Stunning Array. It had an unimaginable spirituality. When it operated on its own, it could have the most powerful strike of a powerhouse at the peak of knowing destiny. 1,000 years ago, it was carved by the headmaster in the south of the Vermilion Bird Avenue to guard this great capital. Countless demons and evil spirits were quietly burned to ashes by it in the dark night. When the Abbey Dean entered Chang'an, the Vermilion Bird painting sensed him. When it was about to show itself to fight, the Abbey Dean stepped on its wings. It was just a simple step, but it didn't dare to move. Because the Vermilion Bird sensed the gap between their states, it felt scared. So it lowered its once proud head and buried itself in the cold snow, too ashamed to see anyone. Until then, a voice suddenly came to the deepest part of its soul. The voice said that he wanted to kill the Abbey Dean, so he needed its help. The Vermilion Bird knew who the voice was, but it couldn't think of anyone who could kill someone like the Abbey Dean after the headmaster left the human world. So it was still timid, but the voice kept echoing in the deepest part of its soul, rubbing against it and burning it like surging magma. It was so irritated that even its blood started to burn. The timidity from a moment ago turned into shame. Something called courage returned to the Vermilion Bird. The snow was blown away by the wind, revealing its eyes. A majestic aura rose on the street. The wings of the Vermilion Bird painting broke through the snow and stones and appeared in the sky. With an extremely clear cry, the Vermilion Bird's body left the street and soared into the sky. The Vermilion Bird hadn't chirped for 1,000 years. Would today's cry be able to shock the gods? The Vermilion Bird spread its 100 feet long wings and flew across the sky, arriving at the south gate of Chang, and in an instant, the city walls towered into the clouds, and the bricks were old. The Vermilion Bird flew between the city walls. It flapped its scarlet wings, as if dragging 2 flames behind it. It stuck close to the city wall and flew at high speed. In an extremely short amount of time, it arrived in the north. The Vermilion Bird flew above the imperial palace. The empress held the little emperor's hand and bowed slightly to the sky. Yu Lian raised an eyebrow in the corner tower of the royal city. The Vermilion Bird flew over the imperial palace, lowered its altitude, and dove south along Vermilion Bird Avenue. This world's straightest and widest road was its path. The Vermilion Bird flew extremely fast on this road. Its wings, which were more than 100 feet long, seemed to be setting Chang'an on fire. Wherever it touched, the snow suddenly turned into smoke. No one on the snowy street could react. They only heard a clear sound, and then they saw a fiery shadow approaching. No one had time to think, not even the Abbey Dean. When he saw clearly that it was the vermilion bird flying on the street, he could not help but show a mocking expression. The Abbey Dean rarely showed emotions like ordinary people, but he could never suppress his mockery and contempt for the legendary vermilion bird. Even he himself could not figure out the reason. Perhaps it was because the vermilion bird was the only thing left by the headmaster in the human world. The vermilion bird flew on the snowy street, flapping its wings. The blazing flames burned the air and made a crackling sound. The whole world seemed to turn into a fiery red color. Just when the Tangs were expecting the vermilion bird to kill the Abbey Dean, and the Abbey Dean was about to tear off the vermilion bird's fiery wings, the vermilion bird gave a clear cry again. A flame flashed. The vermilion bird quietly withdrew its aura, turned into a flame, and fell on Ninkei's cutlass. There was a slight burning sound, as if a soldering iron had been stamped somewhere. Ninkei's cutlass had some black burn marks, and a very distinct pattern. It was a firebird with a bright red body. Ninkei's iron cutlass was the combination of the 3 cutlasses that had accompanied him for many years. Just like the primordial 13 arrows, it was the crystallization of the collective wisdom of the Academy, possessing unimaginable strength and weight. Only such a strong cutlass could withstand the great power in his body. However, with the improvement of his cultivation realm, this saber was not as useful to him as the 3 sabers he had in the past, the primordial 13 arrows, and the inexhaustible talisman paper. Sometimes it even became his weakness. Ninkei was very good at fighting. He clearly knew how troublesome it was to be unable to balance the weapon in his hand with his own strength. But he never gave up on this cutlass, because in the darkness, he always felt that this blade should belong to him, and that one day, it would reveal its true sharpness. When this cutlass was made, he even refused 4th brother's and 6th brother's suggestion to carve talismans on the cutlass to increase its power, like most of the powerful cultivators in the world did. Because he felt that the talismans he wrote back then were not powerful enough. Using them on the iron cutlass was equivalent to destroying the cutlass. Even though he could write divine talismans now, he still felt that it was not enough. There was no reason. He just felt that the talisman that was qualified to be carved on this cutlass must be extraordinary. So the iron cutlass had always been dim, without any talisman lines carved on it. The heavy cutlass looked so simple and unadorned, but it was constantly soaked in blood. Until today, with a clear cry from the south of Chang'an, the vermilion bird broke through the sky and turned into a flame falling on the cutlass. Then, a bright red pattern appeared on the black cutlass. Ninkei then realized that it was what he had been waiting for. He then understood why the headmaster of the academy let him meet the vermilion bird before he left the human world. It must be an extraordinary talisman that matched this iron cutlass. This talisman was the vermilion bird. It was the killing talisman in the god-stunning array. The cutlass had been pulled out of the snow. Ninkei raised the cutlass, and the snow suddenly scattered. The vermilion bird divine talisman on the black cutlass suddenly lit up. A bright red flame spurted out from the edge of the cutlass, piercing the sky. At this time, the wind and snow had long disappeared, and the blue sky was revealed to countless eyes in the human world. The bright red flame that the cutlass spurted out was more than 10 miles long. As Ninkei raised the cutlass, it dragged from the northeast to the southwest in the blue sky. As the flames dragged on, a mark was left in the blue sky. It was as if someone had taken a mountain-like brush and written heavily in the sky. This stroke crossed half of the sky, and no one knew how many thousands of miles. Ninkei lowered the cutlass, and the flame from the blade moved down. He began to write the second stroke. In the corner tower of the imperial city, Yulian looked at the sky quietly, watching the flame moving between the sky and the earth. Then she glanced at the cutlass in her hand. It was a huge blood-red cutlass, even as long and wide as her petite body. This blood-red cutlass was the sacred relic of the Devil's Doctrine. After the desolate men moved south, it had been kept by Tang Xiaotang. As the Grand Master of the Devil's Doctrine, It was natural for Yu Lian to have this cutlass. When the Abbey Dean walked on the snowy street, she came to the imperial palace for this cutlass. Judging from its appearance, the blood-colored giant blade in her hand was definitely more terrifying than the one in Ning Kei's hand, and it gave people a stronger sense of deterrence. But she knew that compared to the one in Ning Kei's hand, her blood cutlass was inferior. Ning Kei's cutlass could write in the sky. You finally wrote that word. Yu Lian looked at the word that was gradually taking shape in the blue sky, and suddenly took a deep breath. The snow around the imperial city floated up from the ground as she breathed. The ice in the moat cracked and broke into countless pieces. Air poured into her petite body between her breaths. Her chest rose and fell slightly. Her eyes gradually brightened. Everyone on the snowy street was looking at the sky. Everyone in Chang'an was looking at the sky. They were looking at the giant brush formed by flames, riding in the blue sky. Eldest brother was also looking at the sky. There was no snow falling, but his eyes were a little wet. He looked at the sky and said quietly, "Teacher." Youngest brother finally wrote that word. Then he took a deep breath. Nothing changed on the snowy street. Even the withered leaves that fell on the snow did not tremble a bit during his breath. His eyes gradually brightened. His cotton-padded jacket continued to ooze blood. The wooden ladle broke in front of the Pamir Mountains. The wooden stick was held in his hand. He did not know where he put the old book. The belt on the cotton-padded jacket no longer needed to be tied with so many things and worries. So it began to float, drawing many residual shadows. Ning Kei looked at the Abbey Dean and cut. Because the cutlass in his hand was bound to fall on the Abbey Dean. So he had to cut more accurately. His eyes met with the Abbey Dean's in the street. He did not see any other emotions in the Abbey Dean's eyes, only calmness. The snowflakes floating in the air also became calm. The extremely faint sound of the snow pressing against each other began to become muffled. Time began to slow down. Then he heard the Abbey Dean's voice in his sense of perception. "Your strokes are wrong." Ning Kei was not worried. Because no one could really control the rules of time except for the Buddha. Not even the Abbey Dean. Even if he slowed down time with his great divine power, he was still in the process of slowing down time. That meant no matter how slow the iron cutlass fell, it would reach the moment eventually. He said to the Abbey Dean, "The strokes are wrong, but it doesn't mean the words are wrong." The Abbey Dean's voice disappeared for a moment, and then sounded again. His voice was full of emotion and complicated emotions. "Good writing. There is one more chapter. I will continue. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 805. I never understood why the headmaster accepted you as his last disciple. Although you had many adventures and entered the knowing destiny state early, which is indeed extraordinary for ordinary cultivators in the world, you are not even as good as my son Pippi, let alone Li Manman, Junemo and Lin Wu. What right do you have to be the last trace left by the headmaster in the human world? The Abbey Dean said. It was not until you wrote this word that I realized the headmaster was the headmaster after all. He had never made a wrong choice other than being Hao Yan's enemy. At this time, the snow on the street was like a lead ball slowly falling. Time was still moving very slowly. Ning Kei listened to the voice in his sense of perception, and naturally thought of his headmaster, who was still fighting in the sky. The Abbey Dean looked at Ning Quebec. At first, he was ready to kill him. But when he saw Ning Kei take out the cutlass, he decided to kill him. At least he could not let Ning Kei take out the cutlass. When Ning Kei took out the cutlass, he wanted to retreat, but he was trapped by countless cutlasses in Chang'an. When the vermilion bird attached to the iron cutlass, and Ning Kei started to write the big word in the sky, he decided to choose another way out. The state gap between him and Ning Kei was too big. Even if Ning Kei could write that word, he might not be able to defeat him. The real reason why he decided to retreat at all costs was because of what he saw. Earlier he saw a deep dark night. It's a pity that the stroke order of the word is wrong, and you can't finish it in time. Then when I want to leave, no one can stop me. The Abbey Dean said and then opened his arms solemnly, as if he was welcoming something. As he moved, The speed of time on the snow street returned to normal. The Abbey Dean's fingers trembled in the cold wind. 3 of his fingers on his left hand had been cut off by Yu Lian's cicada wings. At this time, he opened his arms to embrace the sky, and only 7 fingers remained in the sky. They were the 7 Tianqi. The majestic power and tranquil light fell on the snow street, on the Abbey Dean, or more precisely on his fingers. 7 rays of clear light fell on his fingers. The clear light fell on the fingers and suddenly changed. The clear light on the Abbey Dean's right thumb turned red. The clear light on the index finger turned orange, and the clear light on the other fingers also changed colors. Red, orange, yellow, green, cyan, blue, and purple. When the 7 heavenly lights combined, they became a rainbow. A rainbow appeared in Chang'an. One end of the rainbow was on the snowy street, rising steeply from the ground, reaching extremely high into the sky. Then it drew a perfectly round arc, landing somewhere outside the city. This rainbow contained unimaginable power. The street shook uneasily, and the bluestone slabs cracked inch by inch. The people who were standing fell to the ground one after another. The remaining snow and dirty water were all shaken into powder. The Abbey Dean's figure disappeared from the snowy street. He flew with the wind and arrived in the sky along the rainbow. The sky was very big. Although the word written by Ning Ke with the vermilion bird blade was also very big, it could not occupy the entire sky, leaving enough space for the rainbow. His saber had not chopped down, and he had not finished writing the word in the blue sky. His blade carried the longing of millions of people, and this longing was extremely heavy. Perhaps it was because of this heaviness that it was somewhat slow, and the Abbey Dean was about to step on the rainbow and go thousands of miles away. This was a great divine ability. The sky was huge, really huge. No matter how great a bird was, it was impossible to fly across the entire sky. No matter how far one's vision was, it was impossible to see the end of the sky. There were countless cuts and talisman and tints in the city. The chi of heaven and earth was already in disorder. It was difficult for the Abbey Dean to leave. Therefore he came to the sky, thinking that no one could stop him. But the sky was also very small, so small that birds would sometimes collide with each other. It was so small that people who lived under the sky sometimes found it difficult to breathe. A hand appeared in the sky and held the Abbey Dean's foot. The hand was very clean, and the nails were also very clean. There was no blood or dirt. The hand was very steady and firm, as if it was playing the zither. There was no trembling at all. It was the eldest brother's hand. In the wilderness, Sang Sang was summoned by Hao Yan's divine kingdom and gradually floated to the sky. Ning Ke held her waist and followed her to leave the human world. The headmaster stood on the ground and reached out to hold his foot. He reached out to hold the Abbey Dean's hand because he did not want him to leave. The eldest brother did not want the Abbey Dean to leave either. He and the Abbey Dean had been chasing each other in the human world for 7 days and 7 nights. How could he let the Abbey Dean go when the end was near? He was the eldest brother of the academy. He looked gentle and dull, but he had real wisdom. He had a pure heart. He knew the Abbey Dean's real state, and the Taoist heart of the Abbey Dean better than Ning Quebec. He knew that the Abbey Dean would leave at all costs after Ning Ke wrote that word. Therefore he was prepared in advance. He took a breath. The withered leaves did not tremble. Only the belt around his waist fluttered. That was the sign of entering the limitless state. When the Abbey Dean stepped on the rainbow and flew to the blue sky, he chased after him. He had never been so close to the blue sky, nor so far from the earth. He reached the blue sky with the limitless state, but he might not be able to return to the earth safely. He chased after the Abbey Dean with his life, again and again. The eldest brother was not the only one who was prepared in advance. Yu Lian was also prepared. She stood in the turret of the imperial palace and looked at the word that was gradually completed in the blue sky. She took a deep breath. As she breathed, the snow and ice cracked. Countless chilly air poured into her body. Then, all the air was spat out from between her lips. The air rubbed against each other at high speed, making a heart-palpitating scream. She bent her knees slightly and sent all the strength in her body to her feet. In the rumbling sound, the sturdy turret collapsed. Smoke and dust filled the air. A petite figure broke through the smoke and flew straight to the blue sky like a stone thrown out by a catapult. She came to the blue sky. Against the backdrop of the vast sky, her figure seemed especially petite. The blood-red machete in her hand was still so ridiculously huge. The blood-red machete chopped down toward the rainbow. The blade and the rainbow collided. Golden and jade-like chips flew out. Although the blood-red machete was a sacred relic of the devil's doctrine, it was still rapidly eroded when contending against the pure Tianqi light. There was a crisp sound of paper being torn. The blood-red machete turned into an iron rod. The rainbow bridge connecting Chang and city broke in the middle and began to collapse. The Abbey Dean fell from the blue sky. The eldest brother was still holding the Abbey Dean's foot. Yu Lian also began to fall. Like 3 meteorites. There was a loud rumbling sound. The 3 landed on the snow street. The remaining snow suddenly scattered, and the smoke and dust rose. Vaguely, it could be seen that Yu Lian was holding the eldest brother in her arms. If not, the eldest brother would have been killed by the earthquake falling from the sky, no matter how high his state was. However, even though she was the current grandmaster of the devil's doctrine, and possessed unimaginable strength and physical strength, she was still seriously injured by such a terrible impact, and protecting the eldest brother. Blood flowed from her ankle. She might have broken a bone. The Abbey Dean was indeed the most powerful person in Taoism for 1,000 years. He fell from the sky as if nothing had happened. He reached out and cast another Tianqi. A majestic power fell from the sky. Yu Lian turned her jade-like hands and 2 transparent cicada wings appeared on the snow street. The power of Tianqi bombarded the cicada wings. There was a crisp crack. Yu Lian's wrists were all broken. It was an unbearable pain, but she was still expressionless and kept holding the sky with one hand. The eldest brother was dying. She had to hold up the sky. Killing the Abbey Dean and Chang, and was what the Academy wanted and had to do. In the original plan, the eldest brother and she had made, Ning Ke should repair the God-stunning array, and at least trap the Abbey Dean in a specific position. Then she and the eldest brother would burn their lives to launch the strongest attack. However, things never went according to plan. Ning Ke could not repair the God-stunning array in time. The Abbey Dean was more powerful than the Academy had imagined. Fortunately, Ning Ke could write that character now. Then what the eldest brother and Yu Lian needed to do was to trap the Abbey Dean, and leave the chance for Ning Ke to kill him. A rainbow fell. The Abbey Dean went straight up to the sky, and then fell to the dust. Ning Ke's cutlass finally arrived. The iron cutlass was very black, and the vermilion bird pattern was dark red. The vermilion bird was the full power of the knowing destiny state. At this time, the chi of heaven and earth in Chang, and entered Ning Ke's body through the array pestle, and then transferred to the iron cutlass. The power of the cutlass had already surpassed the 5 states. A hurricane suddenly rose on the snow street. The cutlass wind was everywhere. All the debris on the street was rolled up by the cutlass wind, and chopped toward the Abbey Dean. The view on the street became dark. The Abbey Dean's figure suddenly faded away and disappeared. Only the sound of wind and collision could be heard. Countless sharp cutlasses broke through the air. The chi of heaven and earth generated countless dangerous turbulence, and some places even had large-scale distortions. Every distortion was like a mirror. Knives could be seen in some mirrors. A faint figure could be seen in some mirrors. A cyan Taoist robe could be seen in some mirrors. A piece of the cyan robe fell on the street. The Abbey Dean landed on the street. He was covered in blood, and no one knew how many cutlasses had cut him. Blood was flowing, and there were countless cuts. Some of the cuts were deep, some were shallow, and the shapes were different. The flesh on some parts of his body was almost cut off, revealing the ghastly white bones. He looked extremely miserable. Ning Ke's cutlass penetrated all the chi of heaven and earth. No matter where the Abbey Dean was hiding, he would be cut out by Ning Quebec. When the cutlass reached his body, the Abbey Dean used the boundless state of the Buddhism sect, just like the previous 2 times. However, this time was different from the previous 2 times, because Ning Ke had more than one cutlass. He borrowed a cutlass from everyone in Chang'an City. All the cutlasses in Chang'an City fell on the Abbey Dean. The sea was boundless, and the number of cutlasses was innumerable. The Abbey Dean killed thousands of people on this street. Therefore, he was cut into pieces on this street. He let out an extremely shrill and mournful scream. He was in extreme pain. "Old master, I didn't embarrass you. The person who embarrassed me was Chen Mao. He was in pain." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 806. In the roar, the Abbey Dean came to Ning, Quebec. Every step on the snow street was stained with blood. Yulian cut off the Rainbow Bridge. An eldest brother held his feet. He could not leave Chang'an City by air, so he had to take Ning Kei's blade. At this moment, he was as miserable as a sinner who had been sentenced to death by dismemberment. He was covered with blood and bones, but he still thought he could take the blade. The Abbey Dean was still flying like an immortal, a white bone immortal. He pointed at the blade. He looked solemn, like a king of the divine kingdom walking in the human world. His aura suddenly changed and became extremely awe-inspiring. An aura colder than the abyss and lonelier than death passed from his fingertips to the blade of the iron cutlass. In an instant, the blade was covered with a layer of frost. What a strong aura of quietus! The vermilion bird let out an angry roar and spewed out endless flames to fight against the quietus. The front end of the iron cutlass was colder than ice, emitting a terrifying quietus aura. It was covered with frost, while the other end near Ning Kei's right hand was extremely hot, emitting flames to the outside world. Two extreme auras were making the most dangerous resistance on such a simple and plain cutlass. No one knew if the iron cutlass would be frozen into scrap iron or burn all the quietus in the world in the next moment. At this moment, a clear sound was heard in the hurricane that the iron cutlass stirred up on the snow street. It was the sound of metal objects colliding, and then more and more colliding sounds were heard. The wind of the cutlass swept through the street and surged between the streets and markets. No one knew how many things were rolled up, such as iron pots, broken gongs, and musical instruments like flutes. The gongs were hit by stones, the thick iron pots hit the walls, and the flutes started to whimper due to the wind. There were lively sounds in the dim wind, and no one knew who was having a wedding or a funeral. With these sounds, the frost on the front end of the iron cutlass disappeared at a speed visible to the naked eye, while the flames spewed by the vermilion bird cut toward the Abbey Dean along the blade. The quietus was broken by the bustle of the human world. The fierce wind set up by the iron cutlass turned the vermilion bird avenue into the storm sea in the east of the Song Kingdom. The Abbey Dean's quietus aura was broken, and his indigo robe fluttered in the wind. He stood up ostentatiously, and his body seemed to become countless times bigger. An aura as vast and boundless as the sea appeared on the snowy street. The Abbey Dean used the boundless sea of the Buddhism sect again. The pain of being dismembered made him very clear that if he only used the boundless state of the Buddhism sect, it would not be enough to resist the knife in Ning Kei's hand, because there were thousands of knives. Therefore, he used the divine demon realm at the same time. The divine demon realm was a unique skill of the devil's doctrine. Apart from Yu Lian, only the Abbey Dean knew it. Apart from making the body of a cultivator stronger than steel, more importantly, it could create a new world, or in other words, a false world. What would happen if the Buddhist sect's limitless and the devil sect's sky demon realm were used at the same time? Ning Kei came to the coast of the East Sea and stood on the seawall that stretched for miles. The East Sea Causeway of the Kingdom of Song was very famous. He didn't look at the strangely shaped rocks under his feet. Instead, he looked silently at the seemingly boundless sea outside the causeway. There were countless storms in the depths of the sea. The seawater nearby was stirred like ink, with a chilling sense of danger. Waves as high as a 10-story building were set off in the distance. Ning Kei did not slash at the waves. Because the Abbey Dean was not a storm. The storm came from his iron cutlass. The Abbey Dean was the sea. No matter how terrible the storm was, it could never destroy the sea itself. The vermilion bird chirped in the gloomy sky, holding a small stone in its mouth. The little red bird flew to the depths of the sea against the storm. No matter how violent the storm was, it could not be stopped. The vermilion bird became a little black dot in the sky. It took the small stone in its mouth and threw it into the sea. The stone fell into the raging sea and was swallowed instantly. It did not even make a noticeable splash. The vermilion bird was not discouraged. It chirped and flew back to the shore. Holding another stone in its mouth, it flew to the depths of the sea against the storm. The bird shuttled back and forth between the gloomy sky and the raging sea. Behind the seawall, more than half of a mountain had collapsed. At the foot of the mountain, there were people hammering at the rocks. The hard rocks were smashed to the size of the vermilion bird's mouth. There were many people smashing stones, so many that it was hard to count. Many of them came from the Wa Mountain. In recent years, they had smashed the collapsed Buddha statues into countless small Buddha statues and sold them to tourists. They were good at this kind of thing. Human beings were good at this kind of thing. Human beings were good at cutting mountains and smashing all the hard things in the world. Behind the sea wall, the dull sound of smashing stones kept ringing for many days and nights. People smashed stones tirelessly, and the vermilion bird flew back and forth between the sea and the land tirelessly. Countless small stones were thrown into the sea by the vermilion bird. This was reclamation. The sea was immeasurable. But as long as it kept filling, it would be filled up one day. The immeasurable was broken by the immeasurable of the human world. The Abbey Dean became a barren field. It had been raining heavily for half a year. It was said that the flood was a punishment from Haotian. Anyone who disrespected Haotian would die in this terrible disaster. If one wanted to avoid the flood, he had to walk through the wilderness. However, the wilderness was covered with knee-high weeds and muddy marshes. Some places seemed safe, but dangerous quicksand was hidden. Even the most ferocious beasts did not dare to walk in the wilderness. The first person came to the periphery of the wilderness. He was hesitant because there was no road in the wilderness. He did not know how to walk and what was the right way. More and more people came to the wilderness. They wanted to walk through the wilderness and find a new world. However, like the first person, they did not know where the road was. They discussed for a long time, and even began to quarrel, but they could not come up with an idea. Please make way. A young man squeezed through the crowd and walked into the wilderness. His luggage was simple. The only useful thing was probably the rusty chopper in his hand. What was more worrying was that he was carrying a skinny little girl on his back. People tried to persuade him that it was dangerous in the wilderness. The most important thing was that there was no road. The young man ignored them and continued to walk into the wilderness. He only held the chopper in his hand tighter. Looking at the back of the young man disappearing in the weeds of the wilderness, the crowd was silent for a long time. Someone tightened the luggage on his back and followed him into the wilderness. Someone supported his tired body with a branch and also walked in. More and more people walked into the wilderness. Some were bitten to death by the poisonous snakes in the swamp. Some sank into the depths of the quagmire, and some became dried corpses under the quicksand. However, there were even more people who successfully walked through the wilderness and went to a new world. There was no road in the world. As long as more people walked, there would be a road. The divine demon realm was broken by the persistence of the human world. The Abbey Dean displayed three states at the same time: the nirvana of Taoism, the immeasurable of Buddhism, and the divine demon realm of Devil's doctrine. These three states were all above the 5 states. Ninkei simply chopped. One chop broke them all. The Abbey Dean's finger was still on the blade. The snow and frost on the iron blade had disappeared. The momentum of the blade and the blazing flame were gone with the wind. There was a thin cut on the Abbey Dean's finger. Then more than 10 extremely miserable cuts appeared on his body. Some of the flesh that had been cut was blown away by the wind, while others drooped outwards, exposed to the dusky wind. Blood flowed down from his body like a waterfall. He looked very miserable. He looked so miserable that it was impossible for him to live. But the Abbey Dean was still alive. The most powerful person in Taoism for thousands of years would not die so easily. But he was only one step away from death, or returning to Haotian's divine kingdom. If he could not resist Ninkei's thousands of cuts, then everything would be over. The Abbey Dean had looked down on the world all his life, and had rarely felt the shadow of death. He was defeated by Koharen's sword once. He was hit by the headmaster's wooden stick once. But even these 2 times, he survived and went further on the path of cultivation. Only the great fear between life and death could give a person like the Abbey Dean a chance to understand Tao. Today, he saw the abyss between life and death again in front of Ning Kei's blade. Could he understand something? The Abbey Dean looked at Ning Kei with a very strange expression on his face. It was not indifferent regret nor anger. It had nothing to do with unwillingness. It was not an expression that a human should have. It was extremely calm and showed indifference. The deepest part of the indifference was not coldness, but emptiness. There was no emotion. An emotionless expression should not be called an expression, but Ning Kei felt that it was, and he was very vigilant. There was no emotion in the Abbey Dean's eyes, and even his pupils gradually faded. It was not faint like when he used the gray eyes, but really faint. The Abbey Dean's eyes were so faint that they were almost transparent. They were no longer jade but tasteless water. Then he suddenly retracted his fingers. Ning Kei's iron cutlass fell down. Before the blade arrived, the wind had already started raging. His black hair danced in the wind, and blood scattered in the wind. The flesh that peeled off from his body was as red as flower petals. The ghastly white bones were as clean as lotus roots. The scene that should have been bloody looked extremely beautiful at this moment. He turned into a lotus. The blood could not be stained, and the dirt could not cover. It was extremely peaceful. It was extremely peaceful. The broken rainbow floated down from the blue sky, and finally landed on the street. Some of them fell on the Abbey Dean, which suddenly glowed with golden jade, and then slid off. These rainbow fragments were the remnant aura of Tianqi. But somehow, the power given by Haotian could not be integrated into the Abbey Dean's flesh and blood. The connection between the Abbey Dean and Haotian seemed to be broken. He seemed to have disappeared from heaven and earth, turning into snow and flowers that escaped. He was so independent and so untouchable. Looking at this scene, Yulian suddenly raised her eyebrows. Eldest brother said incredulously, "The state of pureness? The next chapter will be broken, but I don't know when it will be written. Anyway, it will be written. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 807. The state of pureness was said to be the most unfathomable state in Haotian Taoism. But no one had ever seen it. Not even in the history of cultivation, after the last everlasting night. For the real powerhouses in this world, there was one question that they were most curious about. How high was the headmaster of the academy? Master Qishan of the Lank Temple once guessed that the headmaster of the academy should be in the state of pureness. It could be imagined how high the state of pureness was in people's eyes. The headmaster of the academy proved his state in the wilderness, which was beyond everyone's imagination. But even he had never seen anyone enter the state of pureness in his long life. The eldest brother had never seen it either. His understanding of the state of pureness came from the scattered records in the books at the back of the mountain of the academy. It was only a guess that he shouted the words state of pureness. He felt that his guess should not be far from the truth. There was no other way to explain the Abbey Dean's change, except for the legendary state of pureness. Ning Kei wrote that character, gathered the desire of thousands of people in Chang, and borrowed thousands of knives, and was about to kill the Abbey Dean. But the Abbey Dean actually entered the state of pureness. The eldest brother could not believe that someone in this world could enter this legendary state. But it happened so vividly in front of him. The Abbey Dean was indeed the most powerful powerhouse in Haotian Taoism in 1,000 years, the only one below Haotian. Compared to the other states, the state of pureness was a higher state. It could be called peerless, because it could be separated from the world. When one entered the state of pureness, all the power in the world became an absolute foreign object to the cultivator. The clear and beautiful sunlight shone on the cliffs, and the green pine trees cast their shadows on the rocks. If a cool breeze blew, it would shake the pine trees, or it would blow away the dust on the rocks. But how could it blow away the shadows? At this time, the Abbey Dean's flesh and blood were the lotus petals, and his bones were the lotus joints. He was born in the clear water, not in the world. Ning Kei's iron cutlass was still in the world. How could it fall on him? The iron cutlass could break 3 of the 5 states, but how could it break the state of pureness? The iron cutlass had cut through the quietus, the immeasurable, and the divine demon realm. Ninkei's fighting will and spirit were at their peak at this moment. The terrifying chi of heaven and earth in his body seemed to be about to burst out. Because he knew, he would think and worry. Eldest senior brother was like that now, but he knew nothing. He did not know why the Abbey Dean was floating, and why he looked much cleaner. So he did not think. He only knew that he was going to hack him to death. His iron saber finally came down completely. The iron cutlass finally finished writing that character in the blue sky with a flame of more than 10 li. Everything on the Vermilion Bird Avenue was rolled up by his blade wind and attacked the Abbey Dean. There were silver ingots and gold bars from the Yaman's storeroom, flowers and birds from the calligraphy and painting shop, powder and a dozen hairpins, and an old incense burner from a small Taoist temple. There were iron pots and broken gongs, overnight tea in a teapot, urine in a chamber pot, half-eaten buns, minced meat with the smell of scallions, and feces and urine in the sewers. No matter if it was beautiful or ugly, sweet or stinky, pleasing or disgusting, it was the human world. Ninkei's cutlass had cut out all the aura of the human world, including the filth. Everything was mixed together, and no longer had different properties. It was no longer fragrant or stinky. What was the difference between silver ingots and a chamber pot? What was the difference between feces and gold bars? The Vermilion Bird Avenue was raging, and became extremely dark. The entire Chong, and became extremely dark and then gradually turned dark. It seemed that the night was coming. On the long street that seemed to be shrouded in darkness, dull sounds of collisions could be heard. The Abbey Dean was like a pure lotus with bright red petals and white stems, swaying in the wind. Countless things from the human world hit his body. Minced meat with the smell of scallions fell on his face, and then fell down, leaving some frozen meat juice on his beard, and a small piece of scallion. A gold bar hit heavily on his chest, causing the petal-like flesh to tremble slightly. Then a mark was left on the gold bar. It was the mark of the national treasury of the Tang Empire. A chamber pot flew past his right shoulder, spilling disgusting yellow urine. A box of cosmetic powder scattered in front of him, splashing on his snow-white face. The Abbey Dean's body was covered in blood and filth. 2 rotten vegetable leaves hung on his belt, and there were several clusters of feces on the wounds of his broken fingers. He had become very dirty, very dirty. Even if he had not entered the state of pureness, he had never been so dirty in his life. He had lived above the human world, and traveled in the South Sea. His feet were not stained by dust. But now he was forced to be baptized by the human world, and be contaminated by all the aura of the human world. The filth from the human world was not only outside the body, but also outside the heart. The Abbey Dean was still in the state of pureness unharmed. As long as he could keep his Taoist heart peaceful, his body and mind would be clean. However, his body and mind were the same. If his body had been contaminated by the human world for a long time, how could his heart remain peaceful? After countless years, or even several everlasting nights, the legendary state of pureness finally appeared in the human world again. What a shocking scene it was. However, what was even more shocking was that as soon as the state of pureness reappeared in the human world, it met the most powerful opponent in the world, the human world itself. The lotus swayed in the black wind, as if it could wither or die at any time. The Abbey Dean continued to fight against Ning Quebec. No one knew the result of the battle between the peerless state of Taoism and the human world. Even Haoyan did not know. Jiang Rui was the most famous ruffian in San Yuanli. He was good at cheating, but he was timid. He was even worse than the most useless ruffians. So even the young people looked down on him. He had no fixed residence and wandered around, so he did not receive any notice from the imperial court. In the early morning, he was awakened by the ringing of bells all over the city, and then he heard many noises in the wind. Jiang Rui did not know that it was the Abbey Dean fighting against the academy. He did not even know what was going on in Chang'an. But when he found that the streets were empty, and the government runners of Chang and local government, who usually patrolled the streets, were nowhere to be seen, His remaining doubts were immediately diluted by ecstasy. He went to the lotus pond to steal several bolts of embroidered cloth from the South Jin kingdom. When he found that a yaman's warehouse had collapsed, he was about to pick up some silver, but he hesitated because of fear. Although he was a ruffian, like other Tangs, he felt that dignity was very important. So when he returned to the small yard, he felt ashamed of his previous cowardice. In order not to feel ashamed, he decided to do something that he had wanted to do for a long time. He took out a sharp knife and sneaked into the yard of Li Zheng's house, ready to stab the big yellow dog that had bitten him when he was young. More than a decade had passed since that incident, and the big yellow dog from back then had already become an old yellow dog. It did not have the power to resist at all, and it died as soon as Yangming stabbed it with the sharp knife. Jiang Rui even doubted whether the old yellow dog was stabbed to death by himself or died of old age. Anyway, he had accomplished what he wanted to do the most in his life. He carried the old yellow dog back to the small yard and began to peel and cut it into pieces. Then he lit the stove and prepared to cook a pot of dog meat. At this time, he heard a conversation coming from the street. He could not understand the conversation, but then he heard two young people crying. He recognized that one of them should be the cold-eyed boy from the Zhang family. Jiang Rui held the top of the wall with both hands and looked at the street. Then he roughly understood what was happening in Chang'an. He was very scared and hurried back to the yard. He stared blankly at the unboiled water in the pot and the dog meat on the chopping board for a while. He stabbed the sharp knife into the chopping board and poured the bloody dog meat into the pot of water. He pushed down the old and loose wall that had not been repaired for many years, picked up a dozen bricks, and held them in his arms. Then with great difficulty, he climbed up the wall again, took out a brick, and threw it at the Taoist priest on the street. He thought it was safer this way. Thinking of the pot of dog meat, he was a little angry and felt sorry for the old yellow dog. So he cursed at the Taoist priest. "I'll smash you to death, son of a bitch." Jiang Rui died just like that. No one would ever know that he had fulfilled the biggest wish of his life today. No one would ever know that half of the wall in the small yard had collapsed, and the dog meat was cooking in the pot. The Abbey Dean's quietus will shrouded the whole Chang'an. The firewood in the stove was frozen out, and the water in the pot no longer heated up. The dog meat in the water continued to soak like that, and a lot of blood came out. Ning Kai pulled out his padao from the snowy street. The sharp knife on the chopping board in the small yard jumped up. The blood on the knife was still fresh. The pot not far away was steaming. A word appeared in the blue sky. A gust of wind blew on the Vermilion Bird Avenue. The world became extremely dark. Chang'an seemed to fall into the night ahead of time. The small yard was also in the dark. The black wind was very violent. It blew everywhere and broke the eaves in the marketplace. The remaining half of the wall in the small yard was also blown down. Even the dog meat pot on the stove was blown up. The dog meat pot was blown over the wall and onto the street. Then it fell on a person. It fell on the Abbey Dean. The pot of bloody dog meat was poured over the Abbey Dean's head. The blood and soup drenched his whole body. The dog meat fell on the Abbey Dean's broken body. If it were a lotus, the warm dog meat would be hanging on the petals. The petals were dripping with blood. The Abbey Dean's body was dirty, and then his heart was dirty. The peace of Taoism was finally broken by the secular world. The Abbey Dean's eyes were filled with confusion. "I'm going to kill you," Ning Kai said. His iron cutlass chopped on the Abbey Dean's left shoulder, his real body. Even though the state of peace was broken, the Abbey Dean's state of divine demon was extremely profound and almost immortal. So he chopped with great force. He bent his left knee slightly. The Howran Chi was like a storm. Countless chi of heaven and earth poured into the iron cutlass and dragged it down obliquely. It cut a horrible wound on the Abbey Dean's body. The pure lotus was rolled up by the black wind and gradually withered. Then the petals fell. Ning Kai's knife contained the vicissitudes of Chang, and for thousands of years, and the desire of thousands of people. The Abbey Dean was directly chopped into dust and floated to the south of the long street. Blood spilled along the way. Hundreds of talismans in the streets of Chang and fell on him again. Thousands of cutlasses in Chang and city chopped on him at the same time. Under the dark night, in the wind of the cutlass, the Abbey Dean's 7 fingers fell like lotus roots. Then his legs left his body, his abdomen split open, and his intestines were broken. The dog blood and feces entered the deepest part of his body, and could not be washed away. A human-shaped hole appeared on the South City gate with a bang. The Abbey Dean flew out of Chang'an City. He wanted to leave Chang'an City since Ning Kai pulled out his cutlass, but not in this way. The black wind rolled up the Abbey Dean's body and continued to dance. The huge stones in the lake outside the South City gate were blown into a mess. Even the broken stone array tactics could not stop Ning Kai's cutlass wind. There was a lake 4 miles south of the city. The hurricane swept over, and the lake water was rolled up like rain. The Abbey Dean's body fell heavily on the lakeside. The clean lake water fell down and washed away some of the filth on his body. A few fishes landed on the ground beside him, struggling with their tails. The hurricane created by Ning Kai's cutlass continued to move south. The lakeside gradually became quiet, and the sky became clear. The Abbey Dean opened his eyes and looked at the blue sky. His lips moved slightly as if he wanted to say something, but no words came out. He turned his head to look at the fish struggling in the puddle. The fish struggled for a while, and finally accepted their fate and died. The Abbey Dean looked at the dead fish, and seemed to understand something. The sound of footsteps came from the lakeside. Chun Pippi knelt down in front of him. Finally done. It's inappropriate not to ask for votes at this climax. That's why. Well, I admit it. Yun Kai said today is the Consumer Rights Day, and asked me to ask for votes with this reason. I don't know how to object. I'm speechless. Anyway, let's vote if you want. I'm satisfied with this paragraph, and I've used all the things I prepared. I'll start to finish the questions tomorrow. It might be updated later, and there might only be 1 chapter. Enjoy your reading. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chitian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 808. The whole world had been fighting against the Tang Empire for several months. After the Abbey Dean was killed by Ning Kai, many changes had taken place. These changes might have been accidental, but some were inevitable. On the Xiangwan Plain in the north, more than 1,000 Tang soldiers had been fighting for their lives. At the moment when they thought they were going to die, they finally saw the dust from the south, and the reinforcement cavalry. The situation of the battle suddenly changed. Thousands of Tang cavalrymen from the Northern Battlefront Army rushed to the cavalry of the Golden Tribe Royal Court, like an avalanche. Their cold blades took away countless heads in the silent sun. The battle finally came to an end. The blood-stained meadow turned the light from the sky red. The Padao in Situilan's hand had long been broken into 2 pieces. She wiped the blood off her face, and looked around the battlefield. She found that most of her subordinates had died, but she and her team had finally won. Outside the verdant canyon in the south, it was the most dangerous moment. Junemo held the iron sword in his hand and looked exhausted. He was like the green mountains in late autumn, quiet and beautiful, but the yellow leaves were falling. The disciples of the back of the mountain of the academy stood behind him, looking at the dust on the field and listening to the sound of the iron hooves. They were silent and waiting for the last moment. Muyu reached out and held Junmo's empty right sleeve. Fan Yu, the 4th brother, had been fighting against the Abbey Dean's virtual sword with the river and mountain sandbox with all his cultivation. At this time, even he struggled to walk out of the iron shelter. Since they were from the same sect, they should live and die together. The cavalry of the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army came to the verdant canyon again. During the past 7 days, the disciples of the academy had defeated the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army many times. Both they and the Divine Hall Coalition Army were tired of this scene. It would be different this time. It would probably be the last time. At this moment, the 4th brother suddenly felt that the river and mountain sandbox in his hand had become much lighter. He sensed it, and was shocked to find that the virtual sword could no longer be found in the sandbox. People in front of the verdant canyon did not know what had happened in Chang'an. But there was only one possibility, that the Abbey Dean's virtual sword had disappeared. That was the Abbey Dean was dead or disabled. Fourth brother was well aware of the academy's preparations in Chang'an. He knew that his senior brothers, senior sisters and youngest brother were trying their best to kill the Abbey Dean, but he did not have much hope for it. Because he was good at calculation, he could not figure out how the academy could kill the Abbey Dean, no matter how hard he tried. However, at this time, the virtual sword in the river and mountain sandbox disappeared without a trace. Whether he believed it or not, it showed that something must have happened in Chang'an City. He said in a hoarse voice, "The Abbey Dean has lost." His voice was hoarse not only because of the exhaustion he felt after enduring the phantom sword for several days, but also because of his irrepressible excitement and disbelief. Everyone in the academy heard this. Silence reigned. Suddenly, Junemo raised his iron sword and pointed it at the field, laughing out loud. Beigong Weiyong roared with laughter as he plucked at the strings of his zither. Shiman Buhua laughed out loud and slapped his palms with the flute. The sixth brother gave a simple and honest smile and held the iron hammer in his hand tighter. Wang Qi smiled faintly. The black flowers on his temples seemed to have gained some color. Teak Mu was a woman, so she didn't know how to be heroic. She didn't smile, but her eyes were wet. The cavalrymen of the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army were right in front of them. However, the Academy's disciples did not seem to care. They laughed out loud and were extremely pleased. Their hearty laughter echoed in front of the verdant canyon and spread far away along the green mountains. Whether the Abbey Dean was dead or alive, and whether they could defend the verdant canyon or not, as long as Chang'an City was safe and sound, the Academy and the Tang Empire could keep the last hope. They had guarded the verdant canyon for 7 days with their lives. Wasn't it for the hope? And the hope was not lost. It was in their hands. To be more precise, it was in the hands of the fourth brother. Under the puzzled gaze of his fellow disciples, the fourth brother walked to the forefront. Looking at the cavalrymen coming like iron streams, and the sword light looming in the air, he raised the river and mountain sandbox. The fourth brother's face became extremely pale, and his cheeks became much thinner. He poured all his psyche power into the river and mountain sandbox. The river and mountain sandbox was a sand table, which contained the finest yellow sand. There were rivers and mountains in the sandbox, and each grain of sand was a peak and a stone bridge in the great rivers and mountains. The yellow sand danced wildly in front of the verdant canyon. The sky was covered, and the field became extremely dark. The cavalrymen of the divine halls of West Hill rushed into the yellow sand, and then got lost. From time to time, there were shrill screams, and the sound of heavy objects hitting each other. After a long time, the yellow sand gradually fell. The verdant canyon returned to peace, and there were many corpses of cavalrymen and horses in the field. The river and mountain sandbox could not change the fate of the disciples of the Academy, because the Divine Hall Coalition Army was ready to charge again after a little reorganization. So I will write 7,000 words on Sunday. Have a good weekend. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 809. The black wind caused by Ning Kei's blade had blown across the long street and cut the Abbey Dean black and blue all over. The Abbey Dean had fallen to the lakeside like a dead fish, but it did not stop there. Instead, it continued to head south. 2,000 elite cavalrymen were dozens of miles south of the city. They did not know what had happened in Chang'an, and were still dreaming of killing and looting after entering the city. Only a few people in the West Hill Divine Palace knew the Abbey Dean's overall plan, but Long Qing was one of them. In a sense, he was the Abbey Dean's last disciple at the South Sea. Long Qing thought that he knew what was happening in Chang'an. He had come all the way here at all costs just to cooperate with the Abbey Dean. The Abbey Dean should have defeated the Academy and broken the God-stunning array. Without any official army to protect Chang'an was a sinner waiting for death in front of his 2,000 cavalrymen. Thinking of this, Long Qing could not help but feel happy. His cavalry would be the first army to attack Chang'an in history, and it would also be the last army to destroy Chang'an. He was the prince of the Yin kingdom, and the divine son of West Hill. It was his lifelong wish to destroy Chang'an and the Tang Empire. In order to achieve this wish, he had put in too much effort. Even his soul had been tested by ice and fire countless times. He had long been covered with cuts and bruises. For him, there was one more thing he had to accomplish while destroying Chang'an: to kill Ning Kai, an opponent who had left too many cruel memories in his life. In the green mountains behind the Jisho Abbey, he had used the gray eyes to devour the Halfman Taoist's lifetime cultivation. In the wilderness, he had also devoured the spiritual power of many priests of the palace. Now he had forcibly raised his state to the peak of the knowing destiny state. Although he knew that Ning Kai had also entered the knowing destiny state, he firmly believed that he would definitely win this time. From the banquet in Chang, and to the stone path in the back of the mountain of the academy, to the arrow on the snow cliff in the wilderness, and to the autumn rain outside the Red Lotus Temple, he had lost to Ning Kai too many times. What made him most angry was that Ning Kai was clearly inferior to him in all aspects. But he still lost again and again. If fate really existed in the world, and if Haotian really looked down on the human world calmly and lovingly, then after so many inexplicable defeats, it should be his turn to win. The more he paid, the sweeter the fruit he harvested. Looking at the looming city in the north, Long Qing thought of the scene when he entered the city, and the scene of Ning Kai falling painfully under his sword. He suddenly felt that all the pain he had suffered in the past few years had turned into an intoxicating fragrance. The houses on the side of the road collapsed in the raging fire, and the flames danced on the silver mask. His eyes, which were exposed outside the mask, were calm as usual, but the hand holding the reins trembled slightly. At this moment, the raging fire in the village suddenly extinguished. Long Qing looked at the village that had suddenly become extremely quiet. He looked at the scorched earth and ruins that were emitting black smoke, and looked at the quiet field. He raised his eyebrows slightly, and an extremely strange feeling arose in his heart. Even the most violent rain could not extinguish such a huge fire in such a short time. Even the most violent wind could not blow out all the flames in the village. Moreover, the dark clouds in the sky dispersed, revealing the clear blue sky. There was no trace of rain. The field on both sides of the official road was unusually quiet, and there was not even a trace of wind. What on earth happened? The surrounding cavalrymen also noticed this strange scene, and they looked around in confusion. Long Qing did not look in any other direction, but just stared at the other end of the official road. This straight and spacious official road led directly to Chang'an City, and it was the Vermilion Bird School. He could vaguely see a black sandstorm whistling over from afar. Long Qing did not know what the black wind was, but his heart subconsciously beat faster. His Taoist heart shook slightly, an endless fear arose in him. He just wanted to run away. Disperse. Avoid the wind. Long Qing's face was slightly pale, and he sternly shouted to the 2,000 cavalrymen scattered around. Then he lifted the reins, and wanted to gallop down the official road to the scorched ruins of the village. These 2,000 cavalrymen were a mix of the papal cavalrymen of the Divine Hall and the Left-Tent Palace's direct cavalry. They were Long Qing's most loyal and elite subordinates. They were well-trained and disciplined. Although the cavalrymen did not know what had happened, and they did not see the black wind in the distance, they did not hesitate to lift the reins and kick the horses when they heard Long Qing's stern command. They desperately scattered to the fields on both sides of the official road. As a powerhouse at the peak of knowing destiny state, Long Qing's sense of danger was very accurate and timely. The 2,000 cavalrymen also perfectly demonstrated their mobility and made the fastest response. However, the black wind from Chang'an City had already gone beyond the scope of the human world, and it could not even be described with speed. In an instant, it rushed more than 10 miles and came to the front of Long Qing and the cavalrymen. Wind was the flow of air. Air itself had no color, so the wind in the human world had always been colorless. The reason why the raging wind was black was that it was mixed with many things. Mud, dirty snow, teapot leftovers, iron pots and bricks were all in this violent wind. The clear light from the sky could not fall on the ground, so it looked so dim. What was truly terrifying was that apart from the hard objects in the black wind, there were also countless saber intents hidden in it. These saber intents were so sharp that even the whistling sound of the wind seemed to be cut into countless pieces by them. Some cavalrymen, who did not have time to rush into the field and were still on the official road, were the first to encounter the black wind. They screamed in horror and then suddenly stopped shouting. Their bodies were cut into countless pieces, and their mounts were also cut into countless pieces at the same time, and then were rolled up by the wind. Those cavalrymen who scattered to the field did not avoid the edge of the black wind. Even if they dismounted and hid behind the broken wall was cut, and then they were cut. They hid behind the mound, and then the mound was overturned by the wind, and then they were also rolled up by the wind, and no one knew where they went. The black wind came, as if it was the deepest and darkest night. In the thick darkness, only the sound of countless knives cutting through the air could be heard, but no one wielding the knives could be seen. The cavalrymen screamed in despair, and then died one after another. Long Qing looked at the houses in front of him that were cut into countless pieces by the wind, and his face turned slightly pale. At this moment, the black wind was already in front of him, and he finally saw some details in the wind. He saw the utensils of the ordinary people in Chang'an City, and then he saw the knife marks. He knew who wielded these knives. With a clear roar, he took out the dark and quiet peach blossom from his chest and faced the black wind. This was his natal peach blossom, and he did not hesitate to use his lifelong cultivation. However, even though the Abbey Dean had comprehended the state of pureness between life and death, and turned white bones and flesh into white stems and red lotuses, he was still cut by the black wind, and no one knew whether he was dead or alive, let alone him. The black peach blossom withered at a speed visible to the naked eye, and then its petals fell off. Countless tiny wounds appeared on Long Qing's body. The silver mask on his face cracked like a dry field, and then peeled off. After a long time, the black wind finally stopped, and no one knew where the black wind went. Did it disappear, or broke the void, and entered another space? The fields in the south of the city returned to peace, but what fell first was not the clear light, but a terrible rain of blood. To be more precise, it was a storm of flesh and blood. The cavalrymen and war horses that were cut into pieces by the knife and tent flew up with the black wind, and then fell on the ground one after another, until the black wind disappeared. Tens of thousands of pieces of flesh and blood fell on the state highway and the fields, making muffled sounds, and splashing blood and terrifying juices. The 2,000 cavalrymen that attacked Chang'an City all died in the black wind. Most of them were turned into pieces of flesh and blood, and some were directly swept up into the sky, and then fell to their deaths. The branches on the southeast side of the state highway were full of pieces of flesh and corpses. A dozen black crows flew over and circled the trees, cawing cheerfully, ready to welcome the grand banquet. These black crows could not have eaten all the pieces of flesh and blood, so there must be a lot left. The cavalrymen had burned the village, and the Taoist willow had also turned into charred branches. It must have been nourished by their flesh and blood, and in a few years, the willow trees here must have grown very beautiful. Long Qing was still alive. He looked at Chang'an City in the distance. The silver mask was broken, and the old wounds were not gone. There were many new wounds on his face, and his once perfect face was now very horrible, like the ghost corpse in the underworld. He suddenly laughed, and then burst into tears. For the city, to kill the person in the city, he had paid a very painful price, and was even willing to sacrifice his soul. However, when he was about to succeed, he found that it was still a wishful thinking. The city looked so close, but it turned out to be so far away. He had not even seen Ning Kai, but he was defeated, and his flesh and blood were all over the ground. What made him feel the most painful was that Ning Kai's knife did not cut him, and he believed that Ning Kai did not even know that he had been to Chang'an City, and was once so close to it. But he was still defeated. He looked at Chang'an City in the distance, and let out a desperate cry. Ning Kai. Ever since they entered the second floor of the academy, There were busybodies in the world who described Ningke and Prince Longqing as lifelong enemies. But Ningke really did not know that Longqing was in the south of Chang'an City. He also did not know that Longqing had been driven crazy by the Black Wind, and that the 2,000 elite cavalrymen, who were supposed to bring disaster to Chang'an City, had been cut into a rain of flesh and blood by the knife style in the wind. He had cut the Abbey Dean. The Abbey Dean was also the one that tens of millions of Tangs in Chang'an City wanted to cut. He had cut, and the Black Wind had brought darkness to the human world, and the Abbey Dean had been sent flying. It was quiet on the Vermilion Bird Avenue. Whether injured or not, everyone was looking at Ningke's back. It was Old Chow who finally broke the silence. Old Chow asked in a trembling voice, "Is he dead?" The people on the street were all brave, but no one wanted to face such a horrible person like the Abbey Dean again. Ningke shook his head. Countless sounds of air breaking came from his body. That was the sound of returning to the array. Countless chi of heaven and earth surged out from his body and returned to the streets and alleys of Chang'an City. He began to bleed, and the blood was instantly shaken into mist, and there were countless thunder and lightning in the mist. One moment it was destroyed, and the next moment it was reborn. Mo Shanshan walked to his side and helped him up. They also sat on the broken doorsill. The four people sitting on the doorsill did not speak, and just looked at the sky quietly. It was as if there was a beautiful picture in the sky. There was no picture in the sky. There were only 2 traces of water vapor left by the flame that was shot out by the iron cutlass. The water vapor was the cloud. It was a word written by the cloud. It was a big word person. After a long time, the word gradually disappeared. It was as if it had never appeared. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. There were countless peach blossoms in the snow, but it was not the season for them to blossom yet. The academy was very quiet today, even a little deserted. No members of the royal family or ministers bowed humbly. No people lined the streets to welcome them. No grand ceremony, no loud gongs and drums, and not many people came to welcome them. No one cared about this, because they did not inform the people in Chang'an. They would go out to battle, and then come back. Returning to the academy was the same as going home. There were only 2 people waiting for them on the meadow. The cute little attendant, Su Jialuan, and Ning Ke, who was holding a walking stick and covered in bandages. Looking at Jun Mo, the little attendant shed 2 lines of tears without saying a word. Jun Mo had left him in the academy, and he had been living in fear for so many days. Today, he had finally seen his young master come back alive. How could he control his emotions? When he saw that Jun Mo's right arm was broken, he immediately burst into tears. Jun Mo frowned slightly and said, "Don't cry." The little attendant was obedient and desperately wiped his tears. However, there were too many tears, and he could not wipe them clean. When he saw Jun Mo's hair, he could not help but cry out, "Young master, how did your hair turn white?" Ning Ke looked at second brother's empty sleeves and gray hair, and did not know what to say. Jun Mo said expressionlessly, "There are burning villages everywhere, and there is too much dust on the road." It was a very clumsy and even cute explanation, but no one laughed. It was quiet in the carriage. "Why is the academy so quiet?" second brother asked. Ning Ke said, "Third sister dismissed instructors and students in the front yard of the academy in advance. Some instructors and students have left, but most of them are working for the imperial court in Chang'an City, and some have gone to the front line." Jun Mo asked, "How are senior brother and Yu Lian now?" Ning Ke said, "They are fine, but it is a little inconvenient for them to move." The carriage drove through the dilapidated stone gate of the academy and went deeper. The teaching building and the front hall of the second floor of the academy were all ruined, especially the lane leading to the old library and the back of the mountain. It was impossible to find anyone to repair it. Jun Mo looked at the scene in silence. The back of the mountain of the academy was still warm as spring. The little attendant and Tang Xiaodang carried the teachers to the soft beds in the thatched hut that could not be destroyed by the autumn wind. Some were still unconscious, and some were barely supporting themselves. They could not hear Beigong's flute, Shimon's zither, Song Qian and eighth brother's quarrel over a chess piece for the time being. They would probably never see their teacher again. Eldest brother and Yu Lian were sitting in the wheelchair. Junemo let go of Mu Yu's hand, walked to the wheelchair of eldest brother and bowed to him. Then he looked at Yu Lian and said, Xiong Chumo deserves to die. Why didn't you kill him? Yu Lian said calmly, some people are more useful alive than dead. Second brother thought for a while, and did not continue to ask. Eldest brother looked at his empty sleeves and gray hair and said, Teacher once said that we should learn to accept some things since we can't change them. I don't care, but I feel regret. Junemo looked at the gray sky outside the hut and said, I always wanted to be like youngest uncle, drawing his sword and fighting against the heavens. When Master ascended to the sky by the Sishui River, I thought that one day, I would be able to follow Master's footsteps. But now it seems that there is no chance. Not everyone could understand what he was saying. Eldest brother sighed, and brought up another matter. Pippi has left. In the back of the mountain, Junemo and Chun Pippi were the closest. Hearing the news, he kept silent for a while and then asked, Can the Abbey Dean recover? It was the most important question for the academy. Junemo looked at Ning Ke when he asked the question. Everyone in the hut, who was awake, was looking at Ning Quebec. That day on the Vermilion Bird Avenue, Ning Ke had given an answer to the people in Chang'an. But today he still thought for a long time and then said with certainty, No. Hearing this answer, second senior brother's cold expression finally relaxed a little. Even the wind that blew into the thatched cottage seemed to have become a little warmer. The state that the Abbey Dean had shown was the coldest cloud in the heart of the people in the back of the mountain. Although he was defeated in Chang'an, he was not defeated by Ning Ke, but by the God-stunning array. In other words, he was still defeated by the headmaster of the academy. If it were not in Chang'an, but in another place in the human world, no matter eldest brother, Junemo or even Yu Lian, they would not be able to defeat the Abbey Dean. As for Ning Ke, it was even more impossible. The sound of the waterfall reverberated in the courtyard. It was deafening. Ning Ke had never understood how second brother could fall asleep in such an environment. He also could not understand how senior brothers and sisters could hear each other's voices when they were discussing in the courtyard. He once asked second brother this question, and second brother's answer was, You will get used to it after a long time. As long as your heart is calm, no sound can disturb your ears. Dozens of days later, Junemo returned to his courtyard after 7 days and 7 nights of unimaginable fighting in front of the verdant canyon and 2 dazzling battles between powerhouses. For the first time, he felt that the sound of the waterfall was a little noisy. He knew that it was because his heart was not calm enough. It was already dark. He stood by the window and looked at the night sky above the mountain. He was silent for a long time. And then he looked at his empty sleeve and frowned slightly. He had lost his right arm in the battle with Lu Bai. The disability of the body was not a problem. Junemo could still sweep the world with the iron sword in his left hand. The problem was the disability of the mind. The body and the mind had always been 2 sides of the same coin. He was very clear that he would probably never reach the end of the cultivation path in this life. The end of the cultivation path was the Great Way. The other side of the river was the other side. It was not above the 5 states but a higher place. It was a place that only youngest uncle and the headmaster of the academy could reach. It was above the sky. In terms of sword Taoism, he was only slightly inferior to Lu Bai. But he was younger and had more potential, so he had more hope of reaching that place. Now these hopes had been lost. For cultivators, this was the heaviest blow. It was even more terrible than death. It made people crazy. Even someone as strong as Junemo gradually turned black. But if someone asked him if it was all worth it, he would still disdain to answer. Because he did not see the water of the yellow river coming from the sky. Because the mountains saw how charming he was. The falling water could not rise again. and the collapsing mountain could not rise again. Regret had nothing to do with the proud second brother. How could it not be worth it to fight with Liu Bai to his heart's content? It was just a little regretful. If we can't fight with heaven, it's actually very interesting to fight with people. Ning Ke walked into the small courtyard. He looked at the lonely back of second brother and said, although the Abbey Dean is disabled, eldest brother and third sister are also seriously injured. They can't be seen and can't recover in a short time. Both the Tang Empire and the Academy need you now. Junemo did not turn around and said, don't worry about me. Ning Ke said, I can't not worry. Junemo turned around and looked at him with a smile. He said, it's just a little regret. Don't think about it. Ning Ke suddenly felt that he did not know this man standing in front of him. It was as if some subtle changes had happened to him. It was not because second brother did not wear a crown or a bun, nor was it because he showed a rare smile. He was still the proudest person in the world, but he did not have the aura that made people stay away from him. This change made Ning Ke a little uncomfortable, and he did not know what to say. Junemo said, I'm just not used to it. When I put my hands behind my back, my left hand can no longer hold my right hand, and I can't salute anymore. The most important thing is that my posture is not good. 2 chapters with 7,000 words are completed. 2 chapters will be written tomorrow. Please vote for me on Monday and report to me. I will try to finish this volume in 4 days. I have been thinking about the outline of the next volume these 2 days, so I don't have enough brain power. I read the 4th volume, The Year of the Curtain, again and found that it is really good. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 8:11. While they were talking, Muyu walked into the room from the backyard with a basin of hot water. She was surprised to see Ning Ke, but she didn't say anything and began to help second brother dress up. I can't comb my hair or wear a crown, Junemo said. Ning Ke said, you don't need to do it yourself since seventh sister is here. Junemo said, men and women should be different. Some things are not convenient. Ning Ke smiled and said, everything will be convenient after we get married. It was quiet. The sound of the waterfall falling into the pond was very clear. Muyu lowered her head and was a little shy. Junemo coughed and asked seriously, what else do you want? Ning Ke was feeling the atmosphere in the room. When he heard this, he held back his laughter and said, I do need your help. Junemo said, besides eldest brother and Yu Lian, you are the only one who can see my problem. It means your state is quite good. Although it is not stable, you don't need to worry too much. It's not about that. Ning Ke clapped his hands and shouted to the courtyard door outside the window. Come in. 2 youths with crutches walked in from outside the small courtyard. Both of them looked very nervous. But if one looked closely, they would be able to see that there was actually a huge difference between them. One of the youths was well dressed. He was obviously very nervous, but he still looked around out of the corner of his eyes, pretending to be calm. There was a kind of stinginess in his eyes. The other youth in plain clothes was looking at his feet. His right hand, which was holding the crutch, kept trembling. If it wasn't for the youth in front of him leading him, he probably wouldn't even be able to walk. Ning Ke said to second brother, in the battle with the Abbey Dean a few days ago, these 2 boys performed well. Judging from their recovery, their bodies are also good. I just don't know if they have potential. Do you want them to enter the academy? Junemo asked. Ning Ke said, if you think they are good enough, you can choose one as your disciple and give the other one to me. But these days, you may need to teach them. I don't have time. Junemo said, you don't have a disciple yet. Ning Ke said, if eldest brother wants it, I'll give it to him. The 2 teenagers were Zhang San and Li Si. After the bloody battle on the snow street, they were taught a good lesson. If they had not been seriously injured, they would have been beaten by the elders. Because of their injuries, Li Si and his family did not return to their hometown, but lived in the Zhang family's house in Sanyuanli. Today, the Chang and local government suddenly sent someone to take them from Chang, and to the academy. The two youths had no idea what had happened. They walked into the academy in a daze, and entered the clouds halfway up the mountain. Then they arrived at the real academy. For the Tangs, the academy was the most honorable place, but it was not mysterious. However, the back mountain was a completely different world, because all the details indicated that it should be a fairyland. It was not until they entered the small courtyard accompanied by the sound of the waterfall, and heard the conversation between Ning Kei and Jun Mo, that the two teenagers realized what kind of lucky chance they had encountered. So they became more and more nervous. Even Zhang Yanzu did not dare to look around. He looked down at his toes and prayed silently in his heart. Ning Kei said, "I know there is a test to enter the back mountain, but I really like these two boys. Now I'm worried that they have no aptitude for cultivation, like I did in the past." Junemo said, "Since you can cultivate, so can they. As long as the academy is willing to teach people, there is no one that cannot be taught. If you want them to stay, then stay." Ning Kei did not stay any longer. He said a few words to the two teenagers and left. Seventh sister sent him out of the hospital. At the gate of the courtyard, she met someone who was talking. The two teenagers were in extreme shock and happiness, and did not notice Ning Kei's departure. They looked at the one-armed man in front of them in awe, and waited for his instructions. At this moment, a big white goose walked into the small courtyard, shaking its butt. It came to the front of the house with familiarity, and clumsily stepped over the high threshold. It walked to Junmo's feet and sat down, closing its eyes to rest. It was injured when the hierarch broke into the mountain, and had not yet recovered. It was a little listless. Otherwise, if it saw two strangers in its own yard, who knew what would happen? Even so, the two teenagers were still shocked by the big white goose that seemed to know how to behave. When you learn the rules of the academy in the future, the first thing you have to learn is to be calm in the face of danger. Junemo looked at the two teenagers and said expressionlessly, "Go to the yard and stand. You are not allowed to use crutches. You are not allowed to bend your knees and close your eyes. If you can see the first ray of sunlight tomorrow morning, you will pass." Colliding with the big white goose at the gate of the small courtyard, Ning Kei was almost pecked by it. If it were not for the fact that it was not in good spirits, he would definitely not let it go. He said angrily, "Senior sister, when you become the owner of this small courtyard in the future, you can't be like senior brother, who is so strict with Jialuan and spoils the big white goose. You have to control that animal more. Can't you see that I am also a disabled person now? How dare it bite me?" Muyu was a little nervous. Hearing his words, she did not know what to say. She asked in a low voice, "Did you already know about this?" Ning Kei said with a smile, "We are not blind." Muyu twisted the embroidered handkerchief in her hand into a flower, and explained in a low voice, "It was he who liked me first." Ning Kei said, "The headmaster is not here. Who dares to care about this?" Muyu said cautiously, "Even if the headmaster is still here, he won't disagree, right?" Ning Kei looked at the bright moon in the night sky, and somehow felt a little annoyed. He said, "Who knows what nonsense that old guy will come up with?" "What do you mean by nonsense?" "That is pulling the little calf." "Why would the headmaster do such a thing?" "Because he is close to the old yellow calf." "Younger brother, you are talking nonsense again. Anyway, the headmaster is not reliable." "Well, the headmaster has never been reliable." Muyu looked at the bright moon in the mountains and smiled. Then she turned to Ning Kei and bowed. "Younger brother, thank you." Ning Kei brought the two teenagers to the academy to be apprenticed to the headmaster. No matter what the reason was, he let second brother handle this matter, because he wanted to distract senior brother. That was what she thanked him for. Ning Kei smiled, and did not say anything more. The back of the mountain was very big. Everyone had their own small courtyard, and it was either a mountain or a lake. Even Tang Xiaoding was no exception. Song Qian and the eighth brother played chess under the pine tree all day long. The scholars lived in the library cave all year round. Basically, no one lived in their small courtyard, and it was empty. In the past, because of Sang Sang, Ning Kei was the only non-resident student in the back mountain of the academy. Basically, He lived in the old brushpen shop or Yinming Lake. Occasionally, he would stay overnight in the mountain, but he always kept his house. The night was dark and foggy. He walked slowly along the mountain path with the help of his walking stick to his small courtyard. Sangsang was not in Chang'an. The house at Yinming Lake had been destroyed by him, and the wall of the old brushpen shop had also been cut into two. He had no reason to return to Chang'an, so he would probably make this place his home in the future. His small courtyard was not far from the Mirror Lake. It was behind the dense forest where senior brother Baigong and senior brother Shiman usually played the zither. It was very secluded and quiet. The moonlight fell on the eaves and made it even colder. Someone was waiting for him. Tang Shouting leaned against the mud wall and lowered her head. She looked at her old leather boots and kicked the wall from time to time. Ning Ke looked at her beautiful face and the faint sadness between her eyebrows. He said, "Ask whatever you want." Tang Shouting looked up at him and asked, "Is Sangsang really dead?" She was Song Song's good friend, and Sangsang had very few good friends. Thinking of this fact, Ning Ke suddenly felt some pain in his body. After coming back, not many people would mention Sangsang in front of me. Some people probably felt it was not convenient to mention her, such as senior brother and senior sister. Most people have completely forgotten her. Without waiting for Tang Shouting to speak, he continued, "Yes, Sangsang is dead." His tone was very calm, as if he was describing a very ordinary thing. But the more it was so, the sadder it was. Tang Shouting said, "She is really Hao Yan's daughter." Ning Ke was silent for a moment and said, "Or she is Hao Yan." He thought of the traces left by Hao Yan in the God-stunning array, the traces of Sangsang and Chang'an, and the old residence and past that he had cut off. He suddenly laughed and said, "I raised Hao Yan and even slept with her. Don't you think I am a very legendary person?" Tang Shouting suddenly felt that he was very pitiful, but she did not know how to comfort him, because she was also a very pitiful person now. Ning Ke looked at her and said, "I know what you want to ask." Pippi left Chang, and with the Abbey Dean on his back. He should be going back to the Jisho Abbey. "I want to tell you that I owe him a lot, and I also owe him my life. So if there is anything you need me to do in the future, I will risk my life to do it." Tang Shouting understood what he meant and said, "Youngest uncle, thank you very much." The two hugged in the cold moonlight, giving each other warmth and courage, and then said goodbye. Ning Ke used to think that he owed nothing, but the world owed him. It was not until he went to the city of Wei, came to Chang'an, and entered the academy that he found that he owed more and more. He owed Chen Pippi his life, and he owed Emo Shanshan a favor. Emo Shanshan did not accept the eldest brother's invitation to live in the academy. She still stayed in the hotel in Chang'an. She came all the way from the Great River Kingdom, and left the sect for the academy, the red walls, and the white snow. Ning Ke did not know how to face it. He did not know what would happen to lovers in the end. Not all men and women would be like second brother and seventh sister. Just like he once had a wife, but now he tossed and turned on the bed alone. He thought that all these things would probably pass after a good sleep, but he could not fall asleep no matter how hard he tried. He opened his eyes and looked at the white moonlight outside the window. That year when he left the city of Wei, the starlight was also as cold and white as frost. The wound left by the Abbey Dean on his body suddenly became very painful, and so did his heart. Try to finish the next chapter before midnight. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 8:12. It was very lively at the city gate. Thousands of Tang soldiers walked into the city gate one after another. They had just returned from a tough battle. Their clothes were ragged, they looked tired, and they were all heavily or lightly injured. Countless citizens of Chang lined the streets to welcome the returning soldiers from the front line. There was still no noisy gongs and drums, but there were warm smiles and waving hands. This was the first rotation of the Tang army since the war began. Most of the troops that had withdrawn from the front were settled in various counties, and only a small part of them returned to Chang'an. The imperial court of the Tang Empire had shown almost perfect administrative ability and stunning efficiency during the war. Since the recruitment order was issued, hundreds of thousands of former veterans had either spontaneously or organized replenishment to the front lines. All kinds of materials were continuously transported to the front lines, which finally gave the Tang Empire a chance to take a breather. The tragic war was still going on. The ceremony to welcome the returning soldiers was solemn but simple, and the ceremony in Chang'an was no exception. But the Empress's presence still attracted many people. An ordinary carriage was parked beside the state highway outside the city. The bustling city gate became quiet as people left, but the carriage seemed to have no intention of leaving. It stayed in the same place. Chang'an people were very vigilant during the war. It didn't take long for someone to notice the abnormality of the carriage and report it to the City Patrol Division. The soldiers of the City Patrol Division went to ask. When they saw clearly who was sitting in the carriage, they quickly apologized and left, which attracted many curious gazes. A hand lifted the cyan curtain, and Ning Ke looked through the window at the distance of the state highway frozen by the winter. When he finally saw dust flying, he got off the carriage with the help of his walking stick. Dozens of Tang soldiers returned to Chang'an. Judging from their weapons and mounts, they should be the cavalrymen of the Valiant Cavalry Battalion. The Valiant Cavalry Battalion was directly under the command of the Imperial Palace and was a real noble army. In terms of status, it was even higher than the Yulin Royal Guards. But now the cavalrymen of the Valiant Cavalry Battalion looked even worse than the ordinary Tang soldiers who had entered the city. Ning Ke looked at the man on the horse and said, "I'm really not used to seeing you in leather armor." The man was covered in dust, but he still had a heroic spirit. Hearing Ning Ke's words, he smiled and said, "Since I'm in the army and not collecting rent in Chang'an, I can't wear those old clothes." He was Cao Xiaoshu, who had led the Valiant Cavalry Battalion to the eastern border. Cao Xiaoshu jumped off the horse. Before he could speak, he started coughing. Ning Ke said, "Since you are injured, don't ride a horse." After saying this, he turned around and boarded the carriage. Cao Xiaoshu smiled and turned back to say a few words to Lu Wu. He then sat in the carriage and said, "Since you are here to welcome me, how can you enter the carriage first?" Ning Ke pointed at the bandages on his body and said, "The Abbey Dean poked 7 holes in me, and I've lost all my blood. I don't dare to stand in the cold wind for too long." Cao Xiaoshu looked at his face and found that he could no longer find the Akiji from back then. Thinking of the news that had been circulating in Chang'an, he said, "I thought you were dead." Ning Ke said, "I also thought you were dead." The two looked at each other and smiled. Ning Ke asked, "Why do you think I will die?" Cao Xiaoshu said, "I heard that before you killed Xiahou, you said in front of all the civil and military officials that your story is not a story in the books. Since that is the case, you should die no matter what when you meet the Abbey Dean." Ning Ke said, "You left your wife and children to be a hero with hundreds of cavalrymen. I thought this kind of hero would die in the end to perfectly express his tragic emotions. So I thought you were dead." Cao Xiaoshu said after a moment of silence, "Many people died." Ning Ke lifted the window and looked back, looking at the heavy horse carriages behind. In the carriages were the corpses of the soldiers of the Valiant Cavalry Battalion. They were covered with horse skins. After being blown by the cold winter wind for so many days, the edges of the horse skins had turned blue. You left Chang'an with hundreds of cavalrymen, but only a few dozen were left when you came back. Too many people died. Ning Ke said, "The battle at the eastern border was terrible." Cao Xiaoshu said, "The northern battlefront army fought against the Golden Tribe Royal Court on their own. Compared to them, people like us at the eastern border have no right to complain. It's just that the border is empty, and the Eastern Wilderness Cavalry is rampaging. The volunteers from all counties have suffered a lot." Ning Ke said, "I thought you would come back earlier." Cao Xiaoshu said, "A few days ago, I chased after Longqing all the way to Chintang County. Then I found that the problem was solved by you, so I went back to the eastern border first. If the Academy had not defended Chang'an and blocked the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army at the Verdant Canyon for 7 days, the Gutian Commandery, and the Northeast Border Military could not have been reorganized. Then I would still be there. Ning Ke said, changes in the situation will take time. Qiao Xiaoshu looked at the bandages on his body and said, when will you recover? The question sounded simple, maybe just out of concern. But Ning Ke knew that Qiao Xiaoshu would not be so simple when he mentioned his injury. I don't know. He knew what Qiao Xiaoshu wanted to ask, so he continued, I don't know when my senior brothers and sisters will recover. You don't have to think about it for now. Qiao Xiaoshu frowned slightly and asked, why so slow? Ning Ke said, it's not easy to get injured, and it's not easy to recover after being injured. He thought of his senior brothers who were still seriously injured in the back mountain, and his third sister, who was still sitting in a wheelchair. His expression gradually became dignified. If a Taoism powerhouse sneaked into the Tang Empire's henchmen, it would bring a lot of trouble. Entering from the eastern city gate, they had to pass through the eastern city. When the carriage passed by the old brush pen shop, Ning Ke lifted the curtains and looked at the shop, which was still intact. He thought of what had happened here over the years, and could not help but sigh. In the spring of the 13th year of the Tianqi era, Yu and Sangsing came to Chang'an. Now it is the late winter of the 18th year. In fact, only 5 years have passed, but it feels like decades. Qiao Xiaoshu looked at the old brush pen shop, and the shops next to it. He thought of the spring rain in the 13th year of the Tianqi era, the killing that night, and his bowl of noodles with fried eggs without eggs. He smiled slightly. Ning Ke looked at him and suddenly said, actually, now that I think about it, we are actually not that familiar. Qiao Xiaoshu said, yes, we haven't seen each other too many times. Ning Ke said, don't you think it's a little strange? 20 years ago, when the former emperor was still the crown prince, I met him for the first time in the House of Red Sleeves. We had a fight and then a drink. From then on, I became second brother Qiao. A cup of wine is a life, and a bowl of noodles is also a life. Qiao Xiaoshu said, Chang'an is a very interesting city. Things like this have happened many times, but people living here still enjoy it. So it's not strange at all. Ning Ke thought about it and said, indeed. Qiao Xiaoshu did not return to his home in the Spring Breeze Pavilion. Instead, he went directly to the palace. After entering the palace, there was a eunuch to greet them. Qiao Xiaoshu followed him into the hall, but Ning Ke did not follow him. He waved his hand to let the eunuch leave, and went to the imperial study. His life was full of ups and downs, and there had been many critical turns. Many places were of great significance to him, but the imperial study of the Tang Imperial Palace was undoubtedly a very special place. It was here that he had written the painting The Flower Blooms on the Other Shore, and that was how he got to know the former emperor. It was here that he talked with Li Yu for a long night, and then he chopped off Li Huiyuan's head in front of the hall the next day. He put the stick in front of the bookshelf and slowly moved to the desk. He ground the ink, laid the paper, and began to write. He kept writing, and wrote many pieces of paper. The former emperor liked his handwriting, but he refused to write. Even if he occasionally gave him a few pieces of paper, it was like cutting his own flesh. Now that he thought about it, he should have written a few more to make His Majesty happy. Now he was willing to write, but His Majesty could not see it. It was very quiet in the imperial study. Only the sound of the brush gliding on the paper could be heard. Suddenly a few extremely majestic reprimands came from somewhere. Ning Ke was slightly absent-minded. The imperial study was very close to the front hall, so the sound must have come from there. At that moment, he even thought that he had heard His Majesty scolding an idiot. As he said in the carriage, he was not familiar with Qiao Xiaoshu, but they could live and die together. In fact, he was not familiar with His Majesty, but His Majesty dared to hand Chang'an, and in the future of the Li royal family to him. And he dared to use his own life to complete this task. Because this was Chang'an, and this kind of thing was very common. The trust between him and His Majesty did not start from the flower blooms, but when he heard His Majesty scolding an idiot in the imperial study. He liked to scold people as idiots, so he felt very happy. Ning-Ke came to his senses. His Majesty was already dead, and no one in the palace was scolding an idiot. He shook his head and continued to write. Suddenly, his hand that was holding the pen became a little stiff, because he heard the voice coming from the front hall again. This time he heard it clearly. That majestic voice was indeed scolding an idiot. Her Majesty was scolding someone. Ning-Ke laughed and felt very happy. In the depths of the palace, there was a huge map marked with complicated lines and annotations. Under the illumination of dozens of arm-thick candles, all the details could be seen clearly. A middle-aged staff officer of the military ministry was holding a thin and long wooden stick and pointing at the map. He was explaining to everyone in the hall, but it was obvious that not many people could listen. The Empress was a little tired. She sat behind the desk and took a cup of tea, slowly drinking. The generals and ministers looked at the Empress's gentle appearance. How could they imagine the scene when the Ministry of Revenue had a problem delivering provisions to the Western Expedition Army, and the Empress had scolded them as idiots? Chao Xiaoshu stood quietly in the corner, looking at the Empress without saying a word. But just like someone in the imperial study, he thought of His Majesty who had scolded him as an idiot in the hall. Some people were still alive, and they had returned to their hometowns. Some people had died, and they had also returned to their hometowns. Perhaps they had never left. This was good. 2 chapters tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 8:13. The slender wooden stick, painted with red paint, kept moving on the silk military map, as if it was a torch that was about to ignite the map. The fire continued to spread across the Tang's territory. After the great victory on the plateau, the Tang Western Army did not rest or return to help. Instead, they chose to cross the Pamir Mountains and go straight to Chaoyang City. The army led by General Xu Cheng was alone in a foreign country. If they could finally conquer Chaoyang City and capture the Yueluan royal family, it would be of great strategic significance to the current tense situation. Long Qing and the 2,000 cavalrymen were annihilated under the city of Chang'an. The cavalrymen of the wilderness were shocked and fearful. They lacked effective military command, so they could no longer pose much of a threat to the remnants of the northeast border military and the Tang army, which mainly consisted of the volunteer army. The situation at the eastern border was gradually stabilized and had entered the stage of cleanup. The real threats were still in the north and the south. The northern battlefront army had a lot of new soldiers and could even free the Gushan commandery to help the eastern border. However, the Golden Palace had been preparing for decades to invade the east border. The war was still extremely fierce, and the Tang army was always in a passive state of defense. It was impossible to destroy the main force of the Golden Palace's cavalrymen in a short period of time, and then launch a large-scale counterattack. The situation at the Verdant Canyon in the south was also very tense. The main force of the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army was made up of the South Jin Army, but its real strength was far more than that. Whether the Divine Hall Coalition Army attacked the Verdant Canyon or took a detour to the eastern border, it would bring great pressure to Chang'an, and it was very likely that the war would be reversed again. However, it was very puzzling that the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army's attack was much weaker than expected. Looking at the movement of the supplies, it seemed that they did not intend to take a detour to the north. It was very quiet in the palace, and the ministers and generals were all very confused. What on earth is the Divine Hall thinking? Zheng Jing, the Grand Secretary, said. Is it possible that the Divine Hall still wants to preserve their strength and wait for us and the Golden Palace to suffer losses before they really attack? The Divine Hall wants to negotiate. The Empress pointed to a letter on the table and said. The letter was bright yellow, a color that only the West Hill Divine Palace and the Tang imperial family were qualified to use. The Empress's words made everyone in the hall speechless. No one could understand why the West Hill Divine Palace would want to negotiate with them at this moment. The hall became quiet again. No one spoke. Even if the whole world were to attack the Tang Empire, the Tangs were not afraid. But the ministers and generals in the hall were not hot-blooded youths. The most valuable quality they had was calmness. As long as they calmed down, they would be able to clearly understand the difference in power between the Tang Empire and the whole world. Whether it was population, resources, war horses, or territory, the Great Tang was the strongest country in the world, but when compared to the rest of the world, it was undoubtedly at an absolute disadvantage. Especially with the destruction of the northeast border military in the capital of the Yan Kingdom, the blood of the Qinghe County Navy dyed the Great Lake red, and the strength of the Tang army suffered a heavy loss. Although the Academy and the imperial court had worked hard to temporarily alleviate the danger of the country's destruction, no one dared to say if the Tang Empire could continue to fight hard under the attack of the Golden Tribe Royal Court and the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army from the north and the south, and no one dared to say how long the Tang Empire could last. From a rational point of view, the West Hill Divine Palace's proposal for peace was undoubtedly what the Tang Empire wanted to see the most. However, under such circumstances, the Tang Empire would definitely have to pay a great price. It was even possible to guess that the coalition army would definitely ask the Tang Empire to cede territory and pay compensation. Since the founding of the Tang Empire 1,000 years ago, the Tang Empire had always won every battle. No one had ever surrendered, let alone made an alliance. Could it be that they could no longer uphold the pride of their ancestors? If they were really forced to negotiate, who would do it? Who would dare to sign the document at the risk of being accused by the Tangs of betraying the country for glory? That was the source of the silence in the hall. The Empress said, "The ministers should discuss whether to negotiate or not, and how to negotiate. In short, we should draw up a plan as soon as possible. We must be fast, because every day we delay will mean one more day of death." In the imperial study, the Empress looked at the calligraphy sections that were not completely dry. She seemed to have thought of something. After a moment of silence, she said, "You heard it all." Ning Ke threw the pen into the water urn and wiped his hands with a piece of paper. He said, "Since the Divine Hall wants to negotiate, then we will accompany them. We can negotiate however we want, but we can't lose." The Empress said, "Since we have the upper hand, if we are not willing to lose, the Divine Hall will definitely not agree. So since we want to negotiate, we must be prepared to lose." Ning Ke shook his head and said, "First of all, we have to understand why the Divine Hall suddenly wants to negotiate. You should know that the main force of the Divine Hall Coalition Army has not even fought a serious battle until today." The Empress asked, "In your opinion, what is the reason for the Divine Hall's initiative to negotiate?" There was a pot of freshly brewed rock tea on the desk, and an exquisite tea set on the bookshelf. Ning Ke took out the tea set and poured 2 small cups of tea. He pushed 1 cup to the Empress and drank the other one. Then he took out everything from the tea set box and put them into the delicately curved and beautiful tea tray. The tea tray was like a sea and could hold countless tea sets. Ning Ke took the largest teapot from the tea tray and said, "Now we can confirm that the Abbey Dean has been crippled. So has the hierarch." He took a thin teaspoon from the tea tray and grabbed a few teacups with one hand. He continued, "The great divine priest of revelation, Master Chi Mei and Yi Su have also been crippled." Finally, he tapped the wooden tube that contained the tea and said, "Lu Bai cut off second brother's right arm, and second brother stabbed him in the chest. Lu Bai will not attack again in a short period of time." Looking back at the magnificent war in the past few months, the Tang army had fought bloody battles and ordinary people had risen up. But the real key was the battle between the powerhouses of the Academy and Haotian Taoism. The eldest brother had held the Abbey Dean back for 7 days, seriously injured Master Chi Mei in front of the Pamir Mountains, and the great divine priest of revelation in front of the verdant canyon. The second brother had fought against several peerless powerhouses in front of the verdant canyon. He first defeated Yi Su, and then injured Lu Bai. He had prevented the West Hill Divine Palace army from entering the verdant canyon with his fellow disciples. The third sister had crippled the hierarch of the West Hill Divine Palace, and then joined forces with the eldest brother in Chang, and to fight the Abbey Dean from the ground to the sky. In addition to the god-stunning array left by the headmaster, and the character written by Ning Ke, eldest brother, second brother and third sister, had directly changed the direction of the war. The academy has indeed been crippled, but Haotian Taoism has paid a heavier price. I didn't expect that they would want to negotiate. I even feel that the news came a little late. Ning Ke looked at the empress and said, "Now both sides need time to heal, so you don't have to worry about the academy's attitude. You can negotiate as you like." The empress said, "Yes, time is in our favor." Ning Ke looked at the dim moon outside the window and said, "Maybe not." The imperial study was silent. He and the empress looked at the moon. They both knew that the key to the final outcome of the human world was on the moon in the night sky. The empress looked back at him and asked, "Does the academy have any other opinions?" Ning Ke put down his chopsticks and looked at him. He said, "I remember that your relationship with her is very ordinary. After all, she is His Majesty's most beloved daughter." After saying this, Cao Xiaoshu picked up the dipping sauce and put the fermented bean curd into Ning Ke's bowl. "I'm a little tired. I've written this chapter for a long time, but I won't collapse. I'll continue to write the next chapter, but it'll probably be written later. I have to go to work tomorrow to learn how to play asterisk asterisk asterisk. I'll go to bed early. It'll be the same tomorrow." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 814. This place was not far from the Vermilion Bird Avenue. Some houses had been badly damaged by the battle that day, and some people were repairing them in the snowy night. Ning Ke did not seem to hear Cao Xiaoshu's words. He looked there quietly for a long time and suddenly said, "Many people died on the street that day." Cao Xiaoshu did not say anything else, and started scooping out the mutton offal from the pot. Ning Ke filled his bowl with wine and said, "What do you think about the peace talks?" Cao Xiaoshu said, "It's not convenient for me to speak on important matters in the imperial court." Ning Ke said, "The war is stabilizing, but it is not beneficial to the Tang Empire. Too much blood has been shed, and we need some time to recover. But since we have not lost, we cannot lose out in the negotiation." Cao Xiaoshu said, "Let's eat first." The fragrance of the pot filled the air, and the wine was much fainter. After all, it was a time of war. The double steaming that Cao Xiaoshu and Ning Ke liked could not be transported from the north. They ate in silence, and did not drink too much. Cao Xiaoshu only spoke when the mutton offal was almost finished, and the sauce was almost finished. This war involves too many people. All the Tangs are contributing, but Li seems to have been forgotten. But you should know that many people in the imperial court have not forgotten her. He looked at Ning Ke and said, "The prestige of the academy is too high, and the empress is powerful. Most importantly, because of the invasion, the imperial court and the public are united. Even her most loyal subordinates have chosen to lie low. But if the war ends or temporarily stops, the conflict will erupt again." Ning Ke said, "The officials in the imperial court are not really idiots. The empress has shown her means and ability to govern. They have no reason to continue supporting Li Yu." Cao Xiaoshu said, "You seem to have forgotten one thing. Now everyone in the world knows that the empress is a remnant of the devil's doctrine. Although the Tangs have never submitted to the West Hill Divine Palace, their faith in Haotian cannot be washed away in a short time. They still have a natural hatred for the devil's doctrine." Ning Ke said, "What are you trying to say?" Cao Xiaoshu said, "That depends on how the academy and the imperial court are going to deal with her. If everything is peaceful, she will be imprisoned in the princess mansion forever." Ning Ke looked into Cao Xiaoshu's eyes and said, "If there are any signs of disturbance, I will kill her in the shortest time possible." Cao Xiaoshu looked at him and said, "You used to be very close to her. Everyone in Chang'an knows that. I didn't expect you to be so cold to her. Ning Ke said. As I said, many people have died on this street. Qiao Shaoshu said. I want to see her. Ning Ke raised his eyebrows slightly and asked. Why do you want to see her? Qiao Shaoshu said, let's take a look or talk. Although I don't think there's any need to talk, but... Ning Ke said. I haven't seen Xiaoman for a long time. Let's go. The night street was quiet. The princess's residence, which used to be filled with guests, seemed especially cold and lonely. Even the commoners who occasionally walked by did not want to look at the nervous door. Ning Ke knew that there were many bodyguards hidden in the surrounding marketplace. He had always thought that Li Yu was an idiot, but this did not mean that the mother and son in the palace would lower their guard against her. He and Qiao Shaoshu walked towards the princess's residence. Light snowflakes fell on the heavy gate. The inside of the courtyard was quiet, and there were no lights. It looked like a tomb. After the Xianwei general's mansion was executed, it also looked like a tomb. When Ning Ke had just arrived in Chang'an, he had visited it several times. He knew that this was what a dilapidated mansion should look like, so he did not find it strange. He suddenly stopped, and the walking stick under his armpit fell into the snow. Qiao Shaoshu also stopped. In the seemingly normal night, they felt that something was wrong at the same time. They heard the faint sound of breathing coming from the ancient trees behind the wall. From the frequency of their breathing, they could tell that those people were a little nervous. Ning Ke looked up at the falling snow. The snowflakes fell slowly and looked beautiful, but he was not actually looking at the snow. His eyes brushed past the branches on the wall. Between the branches, he saw the sharp and cold arrowheads. It's a crossbow. He looked at Qiao Shaoshu and said with a smile, it seems to be a Shunhou crossbow. Hearing the word Shunhou crossbow, Qiao Shaoshu also laughed. A few years ago, he and Ning Ke walked into the Spring Breeze Pavilion and killed countless people in the night rain. When they opened the door of the Qiao mansion, they saw a Shunhou crossbow. There was no rain tonight, but there was snow. After so many years, they were once again targeted by a Shunhou crossbow. Their expressions were not as solemn as before. Instead, they laughed, because they were no longer the same as before. Qiao Shaoshu was no longer the king of Jianghu. He had entered the knowing destiny state by the lake in the imperial palace. He could also escape from Lu Bai's sword. He already had a place in the ranks of the strongest cultivators in the human world. Ning Ke had changed the most. Although the old brush pen shop was still his, he no longer sold calligraphy for a living. The once abject youth from the border town was now a person from the academy who had entered the human world. Not to mention a few Shunhou crossbows. Even if there were hundreds of heavy cavalry rushing towards them from the other end of the street, neither Qiao Shaoshu nor Ning Ke would be moved. They were very strong, and even stronger when they stood together. They had seen it in the night rain in the Spring Breeze Pavilion years ago, or in the night snow in front of the princess's mansion a few years later. I just want to know where they are from now, Ning Ke said. Qiao Shaoshu said, they should be the blood cloaks from the Gushan commandery. They are the most elite subordinates of the Hua family in the army. You may not know, but Hua Shanyue has already returned to Chang'an from the front line. Ning Ke said, what is love in the world? It can turn people into idiots. Walking into the princess's mansion, it was still pitch black. Only the lights from other mansions outside the walls could be seen. With the light of the snow, they could barely see the old path between the fallen flowers. Ning Ke had been to the princess's mansion many times. He walked directly in with Qiao Shaoshu, passing through the stone gate and the frozen surface of the lake. They saw the bean-like light on the lakeside balcony. There were many heavy gauze curtains on the balcony. The light was very dim, and the woman sitting there looked very lonely. It was winter, and no one could understand why she was sitting there in the cold wind. Ning Ke lifted the gauze curtain and looked at Li Yu. He said, it seems that your mood has been quite good recently. It makes sense. As long as you have a thought in your heart, you can always get through the hard days. Li Yu was obviously thinner, but she was still beautiful. She ignored Ning Ke and bowed to Qiao Shaoshu, who was beside him. She said, thank you, second Uncle Qiao, for remembering me. Xiao Xiaoshu shook his head and did not speak. Ning Ke walked to her with the help of his walking stick. He rubbed the wick with his fingers to make the oil lamp brighter. He looked at Li Yu and said, I used to call you an idiot behind your back. That's because I have too high expectations for you. In fact, you are not that stupid. Then you should be very clear that under the current situation, you can either stay in the mansion or die. The Tang Empire does not give you the right to choose a third path. Li Yu did not say a word, and only looked at him quietly. Ning Ke said, Why do you do such a stupid thing? Hearing this, Li Yu laughed. Her laugh was a little sad. Being imprisoned to death, or being killed directly doesn't make much difference to me now. I would rather choose the latter. Moreover, I can't let Xiao Man live with me in this tomb for the rest of his life. These are all excuses. Ning Ke's tone was very calm. This calmness was even colder than the snow on the lake. If you are worried about Xiao Man, you can directly send someone to tell me. For the sake of our old friendship, I will not let him waste his life here no matter what. But you didn't, because you still want to get out. And you know, no matter what, I will not let you leave this princess mansion. The cold night wind blew up the gauze curtain and fell on Li Yu's body. She felt a little cold. Xiao Xiaoshu stood at the side in silence. Li Yu looked at Ning Ke and suddenly said, Do you hate me so much? Ning Ke said, It has nothing to do with love or hate. You know that I have always only considered interests. After saying this, he looked around the balcony and said, Come out. It was quiet. After a while, sounds came from all around the balcony and below. More than 10 men in cloaks walked out. Hua Shangyue walked at the front, holding Xiao Man's hand. These people looked weathered and solemn. They were obviously soldiers. What surprised Ning Ke was that their cloaks were all white, unlike the blood cloaks that Xiao Xiaoshu had mentioned, until a gust of wind blew up the soldiers' cloaks, revealing the blood-red lining. Xiao Man, of course, knew Ning Quebec. Seeing him standing in front of her mother, she subconsciously wanted to call out to him. But she suddenly realized that the atmosphere on the balcony was a little strange. Ning Ke looked at her and smiled. Then he looked at Hua Shangyue, and his smile gradually faded. He did not know how this person and the Tang elites in blood cloaks had entered the princess mansion. But he knew what they wanted to do. And that was definitely something that he could not allow to happen. I can't believe that an idiot who is blinded by emotions can bring you out of Chang'an. I really don't know if I should be disappointed in you, or proud of my judgment back then. Ning Ke looked at Hua Shangyue. But this sentence was directed at Li Yu. Li Yu said, I don't believe that he can bring me out of Chang'an. But since he is here, I can't just chase him away. You have to know that he is the first guest that has come to the mansion these days. Ning Ke said to Hua Shangyue, You are now the supervisor of 3 states, only 3 levels away from becoming a general. I heard that you have made a lot of achievements in the Northern Front, but they are all going to disappear tonight. Do you regret it? Hua Shangyue looked at the crutch under his armpit and said, Some things have to be tried before you know if you will regret it. I heard that you are seriously injured. Perhaps you are the one who will regret meeting me at this time. Ning Ke pointed at Xiao Xiaoshu. Hua Shangyue said, I heard that gang leader Qiao is also seriously injured. Ordinary people can't tell that you cultivators are injured. But according to the military, you are as weak as rabbits. Ning Ke looked at him and the dozen blood cloaks and said, Wishful thinking indeed makes one crazy. Hua Shangyue said, There are 30 Shenhou crossbows pointing at you in the night. Of course I can think. 2 chapters tomorrow as well. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chitian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 8:15. Ning Ke held the crutch and looked at Hua Shangyue. Half of his body weight was on the crutch. Because of his posture, he looked very serious, as if he wanted to see through the restlessness between Hua Shangyue's eyebrows. Hua Shangyue felt a dull pain between his eyebrows. He felt that Ning Ke's eyes were like 2 sharp knives, so he took a step to the side while holding Xiao Man's hand. He moved away from the darkness outside the terrace and shielded Li Yu, who was sitting behind the desk behind him. He had said that there were 30 Shinho crossbows in the darkness, and it was not a lie. As he moved aside, a shrill sound suddenly broke out in the quiet garden. Dozens of crossbow bolts shot out from the trees beside the courtyard wall like lightning, aiming at Ning-Kei on the terrace. The snowflakes falling in the garden were sparse, but at this time it seemed to suddenly become denser, and there was a strange power attached to it, forming countless sharp lines. The sharp arrowheads of the crossbow bolts, after passing through the snowflakes, broke and fell as if their heads had been cut off by a sharp knife. Then the bolts broke into pieces and scattered in the air. Dozens of crossbow bolts could not pass through the wind and snow. They turned into countless pieces, scattered with the wind and snow, and then slowly fell down, no different from the dead branches falling from the tree. The fragments of the crossbow bolts fell on the thin snow, making a messy sound. The people inside and outside the terrace had long been shocked by the scene, and they did not come to themselves until they heard the sound. With two shouts, several Tang soldiers pulled out their swords from their waists and slashed at Ning-Kei's head. Ning-Kei leaned on the crutch, and did not even look at the swords, but still looked at Hua Shanyu quietly. Hua Shanyu felt the stabbing pain between his eyebrows getting worse, and his body and mind were cold. Several Tang soldiers pulled out their swords and slashed down, but before they could reach Ning-Kei, the hard swords broke into two with a crisp sound, and then their hands holding the hilts were broken. Two very clear cuts appeared on their chests and abdomens. Blood slowly seeped out from the two cuts and gradually spread. The wounds gradually separated into two sides, becoming more and more horrible. Ning-Kei did not draw out his knife, but slashed the Tang soldiers twice. The knife wounds were only in front of them, but the knife intent seeped into their backs. The cloaks behind the Tang soldiers were cut off by the wind and fell to the ground. Half of the cloak rolled up when it fell to the ground, revealing the bright red side. It looked like a pool of blood. The Tang soldiers knelt in the pool of blood and could no longer stand up. Hua Shanyu's pupils shrank slightly, but his expression remained calm. He looked at Ning-Kei and asked, "Is this the character?" Ning-Kei leaned on his crutch and looked at him, still silent. Then, he slowly straightened his body. His right hand loosened the crossbar under the crutch, as if preparing to draw a knife or write something. The previous two scenes had already shown the unimaginable gap in strength between the two sides. Seeing Ning-Kei's actions, everyone knew what he was going to do next. At this moment, Chao Xiaoshu's hand landed on Ning-Kei's shoulder. Ning-Kei wanted to hear an explanation. Chao Xiaoshu looked at the Tang soldiers and asked, "Have you just come back from the front?" It was very quiet on the terrace. No one answered his question, because they did not know why he asked it. Ning-Kei knew that Chao Xiaoshu's question was for him. He looked at the weathered faces of the Tang soldiers, and after a moment of silence, his right hand grasped the crutch again and leaned on it. He looked at Hua Shanyue and said, "No matter how you think about it, it's just wishful thinking." Hua Shanyue looked at his subordinates lying in a pool of blood beside him, and was silent for a long time. Then, he withdrew his right hand that had been covering Buchi's eyes. He looked at Ning-Kei and said, "Sometimes it's ridiculous to think about it. But even if you kill me, you can't stop me from thinking about it." When he said this, the expression on his face was very complicated. There was some regret, some self-mockery, and some unwillingness on his face. In order to save Li Yu and leave Chang'an, he had made very careful arrangements. However, who would have thought that on this snowy night, the princess mansion, which had been deserted for many days, would actually welcome two guests, Ning-Kei and Chao Xiaoshu. The princess mansion, which had been deserted for a long time, became lively again tonight. The bodyguard office and the Chang'an local government had sent a lot of people to the mansion. The street in front of the mansion was brightly lit by torches. Many people gathered on both ends of the street, looking at the movement over there and talking about it. Basically, there were no good words. The war was tense, and the Tang people were still fighting in the front line. But those high officials and nobles still caused so much trouble in Chang'an City. No one would show any sympathy to the losers. Hua Shangyue and more than 50 Tang soldiers from the Gushan commandery were disarmed and taken out of the princess mansion. What awaited them was the prison of the military ministry. As for what price they would eventually pay, no one knew yet. In hindsight, this rescue seemed to be too wishful thinking. It was not a problem to be judged as crazy. But in fact, Hua Shangyue was worthy of being the leader of the young and vigorous faction of the Tang army. He was not as incompetent as he had shown in this plan. His plan could be said to be perfect. As soon as he returned to Chang'an, he took action with lightning speed. He was prepared for every step. As long as he could take Li Yu out of the princess mansion, neither the city patrol office nor the bodyguard office could stop them from leaving Chang'an. And if he really took Li Yu back to the Gushan commandery, who knew what would happen to the Tang Empire in the future? It was a pity that he was so unlucky. No one expected that Cao Xiaoshu would go to see Li Yu. What was even more unexpected was that Ning Ke followed him to the princess mansion. The bustling and discussions on the street outside the mansion did not affect the peace in the depths of the mansion. Ning Ke said to Cao Xiaoshu, "Do you still want to talk to her now?" After a moment of silence, Cao Xiaoshu said, "I saw her. Then there is no need to talk." "Then wait for me for a while," Ning Ke said. "I suddenly have something to talk to her about." The terrace was quiet, and the accumulated snow on the lake made it even colder. Xiaoman was taken to sleep by the servant woman. However, he did not know if he could fall asleep after seeing such a bloody scene. Ning Ke put down his crutch and sat by the table with some difficulty. He picked up the cup of cold tea in front of Li Yu and took 2 sips to moisten his throat. Then he said, "Actually, I really don't want to call you an idiot anymore." Li Yu looked at the cup of tea and said, "Are you tired of it?" Ning Ke said, "Staying quietly in this garden, even though the scenery is a little monotonous, it is better than dying. You should understand this. Why don't you give up?" "I said that I would rather choose the latter than being killed. Moreover, Hua Shangyue risked his life to save me. What else can I do? Do you want me to tell you?" Li Yu looked at him and said with slight mockery, "That night in the imperial study, you told me that I would slowly see your coldness. Then you killed Huiyuan in the palace. Now is it time for you to show your coldness? If you want to kill me, you'd better be direct. Don't use my idiocy as an excuse." Ning Ke said, "I want to call you an idiot, not because of what happened tonight, but because you still seem to be very confident that you will not be killed by me after what happened tonight." Li Yu said, "If you really want to kill me, you won't stay here and say these words to me." Ning Ke shook his head and said, "It is very easy to kill you. It is indeed more troublesome not to kill you. But it is not the kind of trouble you think it is." Li Yu frowned slightly but did not speak. Ning Ke looked at her beautiful face and seemed to see the maidservant who held Xiaoman and listened to his fairy tales beside the bonfire many years ago. He said, "It seems that you have thought through a lot of things these days." Li Yu still did not speak. Ning Ke said, "There is nothing special in this world. Whether it is Xiaoman's background or your influence on the grassland, it will not affect the decision of Her Majesty and I." Li Yu stared at his eyes and her hands in her sleeves trembled slightly. She could imagine that Ning Ke could see through her thoughts and support, but she did not expect that Ning Ke would still be so cold after knowing all this. Now that the whole world was against the Tang Empire, other than the West Hill Divine Palace, the real threat to the Tang Empire was the cavalry of the Golden Palace invading from the north. If the Tang Empire wanted to completely eliminate the threat from the north, Xiaoman's background and her influence in the Golden Palace were very important. It was because of these reasons that she was sure that the Academy and the Imperial Court would keep her. In fact, you are not wrong. But the Academy and the Imperial Court may not do this, especially when I find that you want to use these as bargaining chips. Ning Ke looked at her and said, "Even if Butcherly is dead, I can still eat pigs." The academy is still powerful and invincible even if the headmaster is gone. I have long planned for the wilderness that the Golden Palace owns. It would be better if I have your help. Even without you, I will still win in the end. Liu looked at him and raised her eyebrows. Even if many people die, Ningke said, as long as it is not the Tangs who die. Liu thought of a possibility, and her expression changed slightly. She looked a little lonely. She said, it seems that the Tang Empire really does not need me and Xiaoman. Did you already make arrangements before the war? Ningke did not expect that she could guess his plans for the Golden Palace with just a few words. He said, it seems that you are indeed not an idiot in these aspects. Liu said self-deprecatingly, then it means that I am still an idiot in other aspects. Ningke said, yes. The street in front of the princess's residence gradually became quiet after the troops and horses left. The snow on the street that had been trampled into dirty water could not be restored to its clean and white appearance for a while. Ningke and Qiao Xiaoshu walked on the street. The soles of their boots stepped on the snow, making splashing sounds. To kill or not to kill? This is a problem that you have to solve eventually, Qiao Xiaoshu said. After all, she is the most beloved daughter of His Majesty. It is best not to kill her if possible. The next chapter before 11 o'clock. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 8:16. The quiet street reverberated with the sound of boots stepping on the snow. It sounded monotonous, as if someone was hitting the old bell in the palace with his palm. It was painful to hear the low hum. The crutch under Ningke's armpit fell rhythmically on the snow with his footsteps, but did not make any sound. After hearing what Qiao Xiaoshu said, he was silent for a long time. Then he said, the academy does not meddle in politics. It is up to the Empress to decide whether to kill her or not. If the academy did not meddle in politics, the Tang Empire would have perished months ago. The academy did not meddle in politics, so the second statement was also empty talk. Qiao Xiaoshu said, should I kill Hua Shangyue? Ningke said, I want to. Qiao Xiaoshu said, the Hua family is a prominent family in Hebei. They are different from the other families in Qinghe County. They have always been loyal to the Tang Empire and have a strong foundation in the army and the court. Especially the 5 camps in Gushan Commandery. They have always been managed by them. In fact, they are still doing so now. Ningke said, are you telling me all this to tell me that Hua Shangyue is not easy to kill? Qiao Xiaoshu said, you know this too. Otherwise, you would have done it even if I had stopped you. Ningke said, I am thinking, if I want to kill Hua Shangyue, should I kill the entire Hua family? Although this answer is a little cruel, it is not unexpected, Qiao Xiaoshu said. But there are so many people in the court that you cannot kill. You cannot kill all the officials who support Liu, because that would be equivalent to the Tang Empire's destruction. However, once the war subsides, these people will definitely worry that the Empress or the Academy will purge them. So the conflict will continue. Even if Hua Shangyue did not die tonight, similar things will happen in the future. Ningke said, I will find a suitable way to deal with it. The two did not continue discussing this matter. After all, the matter or the way to deal with it had an indelible sense of gloom. It was not too harmonious with the snow-white clean street and the hot-bloodedness of these days. Qiao Xiaoshu did not like it, and Ningke did not want to talk about it at this moment. The two walked in silence, and it did not take long before they arrived at the second street of Spring Breeze Pavilion in the eastern city. Walking into the Qiao mansion, Ningke greeted old Master Qiao, and was then pulled to the side yard by Shengguan Yangyu. Looking at the wretched face of the governor, he slightly raised his eyebrows and said, why did they react so quickly? Shengguan Yangyu stroked his goatee. He looked calm, but his hands were shaking so hard that he almost pulled out his beard. He said, It's not easy for us to have peace for 2 days. If we don't handle this well, there will be big trouble. What should we do? Ninkei looked at him and asked. Shangguan Yongyu panicked under his gaze and said, "If you say it's good, then it's good." Ninkei smiled and said, "Who found you?" Shangguan Yongyu said, "Neither the Grand Secretary nor the ministers dare to intervene in this matter. Who else could it be? The Chancellor of the Supreme Court is waiting at my house right now." Through the prefectural magistrate's explanation, Ninkei knew that the Chancellor of the Supreme Judiciary was related to the Hua family by marriage. He thought about it and asked, "What does the Empress mean?" Shangguan Yongyu said, "The Empress asked Mr. 13 to handle this matter." Then he looked around to make sure that no one was spying on them. He said in a low voice, "The young and old of the Hua family are kneeling in front of the palace gate. It seems that they will run until tomorrow morning." "What's the point of kneeling now?" Ninkei said. He understood the meaning of the imperial court. Hua Shanyue's behavior was obviously not approved by the family. At this moment, everyone wanted to keep calm and united. The only place that was qualified to handle this matter and calm the storm was the academy. In other words, it was him. Ninkei thought of the Northern Battlefront Army officers and soldiers who ambushed the Empress caravan in the Northern military camp. He said, "Send the blood cloaks involved to General Su Qi. Tell him that I sent them there. Do it according to the previous rule. 10 heads will atone for their crimes. Go back and tell the Chancellor of the Supreme Judiciary that if the war stops, let the Hua family be ready to hand over the military power." Understood. Shangguan Yongyu was thrown out by the Empress to be the middleman, but he did not want to offend the princess's faction too much. After hearing Ninkei's suggestion, he finally felt relieved and asked, "What about Hua Shanyue?" Ninkei said, "Throw him over as well." Shangguan Yongyu was finally completely relieved. He was most worried that Ninkei would insist on killing Hua Shanyue. After all, even the Empress thought that Hua Shanyue could not die at this time. Shangguan Yongyu left the Chao mansion. Ninkei stood alone in the side courtyard and gently stroked the rough surface of his crutch. Thinking about what happened tonight, he felt that something was wrong. A cough sounded from behind the wintersweet bushes. Old Master Chao walked out. Ninkei was ready to help him. Old Master Chao waved his hand and said, "You are a dead cripple now. You still want to help me?" Ninkei smiled and suddenly asked, "Second uncle, what do you think of this matter?" Old Master Chao said, "Why do you ask an old man like me for important matters in the imperial court?" Ninkei said, "Even the Abbey Dean has to ask you, let alone me." Old Master Chao said, "Tell me." Ninkei said, "I always feel that it is not right to handle it this way." Old Master Chao said, "Because you are retreating." Ninkei said thoughtfully, "Yes, I am not used to retreating in the face of worldly affairs." Old Master Chao looked at him and said, "If you want to ask about heaven's way, you should not care about worldly affairs." Ninkei asked, "So what if worldly affairs always bother you?" Old Master Chao said, "What did you do when the Abbey Dean was in front of you?" There were many braziers in the parlor of the Chao mansion. It was as warm as spring. The disciples of the Fish Dragon gang had suffered heavy casualties in the past few days. The atmosphere in the gang was naturally gloomy. Today, Chao Xiaoshu and Lu Vi had returned. Everyone gathered at the Chao mansion, but did not drink too much. Ninkei and Qi For finished talking about the renovation of the house by the Yanming Lake and glanced at the other side of the table. Chun Lu was drinking hot tea. He did not like to drink because he thought that alcohol was not good for thinking. Ninkei said that he drank too much soup and went out of the parlor to relieve himself. Not long after, Chun Lu also came out. "You are familiar with the military. How is your relationship with the Northern Army?" Ninkei looked at Chun Lu and asked. The bright yellow light shone through the window paper and fell on Chun Lu, leaving a large shadow on his face. After the night at Spring Breeze Pavilion, the relationship between the Fish Dragon Gang and the military was very close. Chun-Lu knew that he could not hide anything in this regard, so he said softly, "We can talk." Ning-Ke said, "Tell them that I want Hua Shanyu dead." Chun-Lu was silent for a long time and then nodded. His nodding movement was very small. If Ning-Ke had not stared at him, he would not have noticed it. The two returned to the parlor. Chao Xiaoshu looked at the two and said, "Eat quickly, the meat is almost rotten. There is something wrong with my brain today. I hope it will be better tomorrow." 2 chapters tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 817. After eating mutton giblets soup and supper, Ning-Ke did not drink much wine. When he walked out of the Chow mansion, he was no longer drunk in the cold wind. However, he still felt restless or rather bored. The carriage went to the guest house. He asked the coachman to leave and walked into the garden with the help of his crutch. Through the snow window, he saw Imo Shanshan writing. The candlelight was the same as before, and the girl's eyebrows were still beautiful. He stood quietly outside the window for a long time before he knocked on the door and entered. However, he did not know what to say. Ning-Ke wanted to drink with Imo Shanshan, but it was already late at night when he entered the room. He did not know what to say, so he said, "How is Cat Girl now? We talked about marriage." Imo Shanshan was about to pour tea for him. She looked at his expression and could not help smiling. She said, "I want to drink now. Will you keep me company?" They drank a few dishes, 2 bowls of vegetable porridge, and a pot of old wine from the Great River Kingdom. Imo Shanshan asked, "You have a knot between your eyebrows." Ning-Ke put down the cup and rubbed his eyebrows. He said, "Is it so obvious?" Imo Shanshan smiled and said, "If not, why would you come to me at night?" Ning-Ke was silent for a moment and told her what happened tonight. He did not mention the dirty things he told Chen-Chi. He said with emotion, 5 years ago, when I sent Li Yu back to Chang'an, I saw Hua Shanyu for the first time at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road. I did not like him then, and I still don't like him now. However, I did not expect that he would risk his life to save Li Yu. Love is really hard to understand. Love is. Imo Shanshan turned the cup and looked at Ning-Ke quietly. She said, "It is hard to understand." Ning-Ke was confused by her gaze. He reached out his chopsticks to pick up the fried fish, but the fish slipped from the chopsticks. He put his chopsticks on the table and changed the topic. "The reason why I'm a little depressed is because of the affairs of the world. That day on the snowy street, countless people died, but they died in a refreshing way. Tonight, most of the people survived, but it made me very uncomfortable. Erba told me that if I want to ask for the heaven's way, then ignore the affairs of the world. If the affairs of the world disturb us, then we should cut them down like how we cut the Abbey Dean. It's easy to say, but difficult to do." Imo Shanshan tucked her fine hair behind her ear and said, "On the path of cultivation, everyone will be troubled by these choices. I once had the same problem, but later on, I realized that I am a very greedy person. I want to question the heavenly Tao, I want to reason with the affairs of the world, and I want to ponder over love." She looked up at Ning-Ke and said, "That year on the Hua Mountain, I wanted to ask Master Chishan a question, but I didn't. At that time, I thought I had figured it out. However, after returning to the Great River, I sat by the Ink Lake and looked at the reflection on the water and the flowing clouds in the blue sky. I found that the so-called understanding was just an escape. I was always a little unwilling. This is greed. Because you once said that you like me, and I still like you." Ning-Ke was silent for a long time and then said, "I like you too." Then he looked at the bamboo outside the window and thought of that long night when he cursed the heavens and the earth by the snow lake. He said, "That day she ran away, but she didn't run far, so I could catch her. This time she ran to the sky, too far to come back, so I can't do anything about it." There seemed to be no relationship between these words, but Emo Shanshan understood. Her long eyelashes fluttered slightly, and there was no sadness on her white face, only calmness. "I like you, and you like me. That's good." She looked at Ning Ke and said, "As for other greed, it might have been possible in the past, but probably not now. I won't feel sad, because this is probably God's will." She poured a cup of wine, and slowly pushed it in front of Ning Quebec. Then she looked at the night sky outside the window and said with a smile, "Because she is God." Ning Ke looked at her breathtakingly beautiful face, and drank the wine in his cup as a sign of respect. Chang'an City was getting colder and colder, and the winter was getting colder and colder. Time passed slowly and unstoppably. Quietly, the 18th year of Tianqi came to an end. The little emperor had not officially ascended the throne, and the Tang Empire was in the hands of the empress. It would probably take some time before the new year was changed. The war had not completely stopped, and the Tang Empire was still under great pressure. No one knew how many people had died, but the new year had to be celebrated, and it would be more lively. Ning Ke spent the new year in the academy. His senior brothers and sisters at the back of the mountain were injured, disabled, or recovering. The New Year's Eve dinner fell on Emo Shanshan and Tang Xiaotang, with the help of the little attendant. Although the dinner was not ready until the moon climbed up to the top of the mountain, they finally had a hot meal. Everyone drank a lot of wine that night, and toasted to the bright moon several times. If the headmaster had the time to drink the wine toasted by his disciples, he would probably be drunk. It was peaceful and warm, as if everything had happened yesterday. But in fact, everyone felt that the back of the mountain of the academy was missing something important. Perhaps it was the teacher who liked to be a food connoisseur. Or perhaps it was Sang Sang who had been in charge of cooking for the past few years. At the turn of the new year, the situation in the world had changed a lot. Because of the cold weather, the cavalry of the Golden Tribe Royal Court stopped their crazy attack and entered a temporary truce with the Tang army. The Golden Tribe Royal Court set up camp in Kaiping of the 7 stockade villages, while the Tang army stuck to the Xiangwan Plain and did not retreat. The king of the Yueluan Kingdom, the commander of the army, and other important figures were all killed by eldest brother. The main force of the army was annihilated by the Tang Western Army in front of the Pamir Mountains. The Western Army took the opportunity to break through the Pamir Mountains and directly attack Chaoyang City, intending to destroy the country. They broke through 17 cities along the way, and only received an urgent letter from Chang, and when they reached the north of Chaoyang City. After reading the letter signed by the imperial court and the academy, General Xu Qing thought for a while, and then forcibly ordered the army to retreat, despite the shock and opposition of his generals. When the Tang Western Army retreated from Chaoyang City, smoke and dust rose into the sky. The people of the Yueluan Kingdom could not believe their eyes. When they were sure that the Tang army would not attack the city again, the entire Chaoyang City became a sea of welcome. Countless people of the Yueluan Kingdom wept bitterly, and then began to splash water to celebrate. On the way back, the Tang Western Army was even sent off by the people of the Yueluan Kingdom. From time to time, the gentry, people, and monks of the Yueluan Kingdom would bring the army provisions, water and eggs dyed red. The generals of the Western Army, who had firmly opposed the retreat at first, finally realized that the perennial warmth of the country could not be judged by ordinary logic. It was indeed meaningless to conquer them. The most shocking change happened at the Verdant Canyon. For some reason, the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army, which claimed to have hundreds of thousands of people, began to retreat to the south. They did not try to break through the Verdant Canyon, nor did they intend to take a detour to the north. Instead, they retreated to Qinghe Prefecture and waited silently for something. The southern army of the Tang Empire rushed thousands of miles to the Verdant Canyon, abandoning countless supplies along the way. Most of the soldiers even threw their armor deep into the mountains. They were exhausted and held on by sheer willpower. Because of the retreat of the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army, they finally had a precious chance to breathe. However, the arrival of happiness was so sudden that neither the generals of the Southern Army nor Chang understood what had happened. The most powerful coalition army of the Divine Halls had done nothing in this worldwide war against the Tang Empire. To be more precise, they had not played any role and had retreated just like that. Why on earth was that? The Tangs could not understand, and the people of the South Jin Kingdom could not understand, especially the Emperor of the South Jin Kingdom, who had been immersed in extreme grief because of the death of his son. It was impossible for him to understand, so he was very angry. Then he died of anger. After the new year, the news of the death of the Emperor of the South Jin Kingdom spread throughout the world. According to the official statement of the South Jin Kingdom, the great Emperor of the South Jin Kingdom had died of a sudden illness because he had been working too hard on state affairs. He had been reading memorials continuously for 3 days and 2 nights without sleep. The Imperial Center Administration of the Tang Empire had found some other statements in the south. Although they could only confirm some fragments, it was enough for the people in Chang to deduce what had happened. On the day before his death, the Emperor of the South Jin Kingdom was furious because of the retreat of the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army. He summoned the generals of the South Jin Kingdom into the palace and scolded them. He even scolded the dead commander-in-chief by Haixin. However, the emperor still could not be happy. He ordered the Sword Garret to send someone to the palace to explain why the Battle of the Verdant Canyon had turned out this way. The Sage of Sword Liu Bai was recuperating. With his status, he naturally would not go to the palace to explain. The Sword Garret randomly sent a disciple to the palace. That disciple was called Lu Yiqing. Then there was no then. The death of the Emperor of the South Jin Kingdom was probably just a simple record in the history books. It was not much different from the gloomy bloodstains in the countless palaces in history. However, in the eyes of those who were observant, the death of the emperor was a very important matter, because it represented a fundamental change in the power structure of the human world. Cultivators did not have enough power to influence the imperial power in the secular world. Many details in the war against the Tang Empire had already proved this. Whether it was the cultivators of the Yan Kingdom, the array tactical masters and sword masters of the Tang army, or the priests of the Golden Tribe Royal Court, they were not much different from ordinary people in front of the charge of thousands of cavalry and the rain of arrows. It was also this war that proved another possibility. The real powerhouses at the peak of the knowing destiny state could change the color of rivers and mountains once they showed their power. For example, the 3 people who fought in the Verdant Canyon battle. The solemn South Jin Kingdom palace seemed so weak and vulnerable in front of the sword of a blind man. This had something to do with the power of the Sword Garret, but in fact, it proved a fact. The headmaster left the human world and went to heaven. From that day on, the human world was no longer the human world of the past. This was the so-called heavenly earth. The next chapter is almost finished. It will be updated soon. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support. And don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.